Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today, we will be reviewing the recent updates to two CSRR guidance documents, Chapter 3 of the Field Sampling Procedure Manual and the Technical Guidance for the Attainment of Remediation Standards and Site-Specific Criteria, the Attainment Guidance. Next slide, please. My name is Jessica Palalonis. I will be co-moderating this training alongside Jillian Schwert. Jillian and I are members of the Contaminated Site Remediation and Redevelopment Training Committee. Next slide, please. So today's training is eligible for 3 technical continuing education credits, CECs, subject to approval by the board. Because of a few last minute changes, we haven't applied for the credits yet, but they will be, 3 technical will be approved. To qualify for the credits, you must be logged in for the entire session and answer 3 out of 4 of the poll questions, which will be interspersed randomly in the presentation. If you have any issues answering the poll questions, please let us know in the chat function in the toolbar to ensure your eligibility for the credits. Next slide, please. Since the board has not approved the CECs yet, NJDEP will compile a list of eligible participants and forward it to the Licensed Site Remediation Professional Association. The LSRPA will then email eligible participants a link to a webpage with introductions on how to access their certificates. And the certificates will be available after paying a $25 processing fee. Next slide, please. Throughout the training, you will see a poll question, and here is what they look like. Next slide, please. When the poll question pops up, you will have 1 minute to respond. Remember that you must answer the question to qualify for the credits, but you do not need to answer the question correctly. Next slide, please. To communicate with us during the GoToWebinar session, please see the chat function in the toolbar. You may submit any question for the presenters in the questions function at any time during the presentation. We will address these questions during the designated question segments. If your question isn't answered during the segment, it will be answered via the email in the upcoming weeks. Please ensure that the questions are brief and general and not case specific. Next, please. At the end of the training course, please take a moment to fill out the evaluation form available via the link shown on the screen. The link will also be posted in the chat section. We appreciate all of your feedback. The slides for today's presentation are available in the handout section right now. Next, please. We ask that you participate by asking questions in the questions feature, complete the poll questions, and provide feedback via the link upon completion of the course. Thank you, and thank you so much for bearing with us during the technical difficulties. Next, please.
First, we're going to start with Crystal Perozic, who's the Field Sampling Procedures Manual Committee Chair, and Crystal's going to get us started talking about Chapter 3 of the Field Sampling Procedures Manual.
Thank you, Jillian. Good morning. My name is Crystal Perozic. I work for the Bureau of Remedial Action Permitting, and I am also the Field Sampling Procedures Manual Committee Chair. Next slide. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 3 that was added to the manual. Before we start that, a couple of things that I'd like to go over. Here is a list of all the DEP committee members that are on the full committee. Next slide. These are our stakeholders on the committee. Next slide. A little about the history of the manual. The original document was first published in 1992. It was created to promote accuracy and consistency, and it discussed how environmental samples are collected and analyzed. It's important to note that this was a paper copy and not electronic. Next slide. This was our first electronic copy in 2005, and it was a complete rewrite of the manual. This can be found on the Field Sampling Procedures Manual webpage on the right-hand toolbar. Next slide. Since 2005, there have been some minor text and clarification updates. The last was in 2011. For a full list of updates, you can go to that link, and we list all of them. Next slide. The current committee convened in the fall of 2017, and this is our final training, and the entire manual has now been updated. Next slide. During the process, we have also updated the website. A link to the website will be put in the chat. Next slide. To the website, we have added a glossary of terms and acronyms. You can also find the 2005 edition and a link to all of the trainings. Next slide. Part of the update process, our group was 32 members. So a work group was assigned to each chapter who went through the entire chapter and made updates. The document was then given to the entire committee of 32 members for review. Once that was complete, the document went to stakeholders and DEP for our regular document reviews and comments. All comments received are reviewed and discussed, and you can find a copy of that on the field sampling website. Next slide. It's important to note that the DEP does allow for deviations from all technical guidance documents, including Field Sampling Procedures Manual. If you choose to deviate from this guidance, you should document that your method is equally protective and any special site-specific circumstances. Next slide. Also, the use of equipment names is just for informational purposes. It does not constitute an endorsement. The sampling technologies are provided as examples and are not all-inclusive. Next slide. These are the chapters of the manual. As you can see, Chapter 3 was a new chapter that was written that we will be discussing today. The manual did also originally have a Chapter 14, which was combined with Chapter 13. Next slide. Chapters 1, 2, and 4 were posted for use in March of 2022. A copy of that training can be found on the website and on the training website. Next slide. Chapters 5 through 13 were posted for use and trained in February 2024. A copy again of both of those can be found on the field sampling website as well as the DEP training website. Next slide. So that brings us to Chapter 3, our last chapter. It was originally called Gaining Entry to Inspect Sites with Actual or Suspected Contamination. However, that was found to not be applicable to our rules and regulations today. So it was changed to Contaminants of Emerging Concern. Next slide. This is our work group for Chapter 3. It was posted for use in February of 2024. Next slide. A little bit about Chapter 3. It's split into 5 sections, and it discusses general information as it pertains to contaminants of emerging concern. Next slide. The first section specifically discusses what the DEP considers a CEC. So contaminants of emerging concern are those that present a concern for both hazard and exposure to public or ecological health. They occur in the environment and are not currently regulated or need regulatory reassessment. CECs include substances and microorganisms, including physical, chemical, biological, or radiological materials. They may be new or known contaminants and are considered a CEC due to a change in information, including new analytical capabilities, new toxicity health effects information, or new occurrence data and/or exposure information. Next slide. CECs can include various types of chemicals and pollutants, including but not limited to synthetic chemicals, pharmaceuticals, personal care products, disinfectants, microplastics, microorganisms, and pesticides. The list of CECs continually changes as additional research is conducted. Next slide. It's important to understand the evolving nature of CECs. It is a dynamic and multifaceted challenges, and it does affect human health and the environment. Next slide. So how does a chemical become a contaminant of emerging concern? US EPA periodically evaluates chemicals as emerging contaminants that are characterized by perceived potential or real threat to human health or the environment based on preliminary health screening, values, or lack of published health standards. Next slide. We also discuss in this section substitute compounds, which are important to consider when determining if you might have a CEC on your site. Substitute compounds refer to a chemical compound or substance that emerge as alternatives to known contaminants, often as a response to regulatory actions or environmental concerns. An example of this is PFOA and Gen X. Next slide. Understanding the fate and transport of CECs through naturally occurring and/or remediation processes is critical to evaluate the effects. To better understand these effects, ongoing studies are needed and continued research is necessary. Next slide. CECs have raised concerns about potential impacts to human health and the environment due to their increasing prevalence and/or advances in analytical methods, instrumentation, and data analysis. The ongoing research is important to not only understand the effects, but also how the contaminants persist in the environment and how they affect various organisms. Next slide. We discuss toxicology evaluations. The EPA and CDC maintain different systems, guidelines, and assessments that detail the various chemicals and substances found in the environment and the health effects. This section does detail some of those systems and guidelines that are useful. Next slide. During the presentation, the presenters will be discussing the chapters, the sections in the chapters, but they're also going to be discussing practical considerations which relate to CECs at your site. Next slide. Thank you. Next slide.
Thank you so much, Crystal. So we're going to take a pause here and we're going to go back to Brad Muser's comments from the LSRP. Thank you so much. So Brad Muser, thanks.
Good morning, everybody. Brad Musser here with Penn Jersey. For taking the time this morning to join us for the class. Next slide, please. I wouldn't mind taking a look at our diamond partners and our platinum partners. Without our partners over the course of the years, these kind of courses wouldn't be possible, all of our events and those kind of things. So please look them up, ask any questions you may have from them. They're always around and their contact information is also available online. Next, please. Our gold sponsors. Again, these folks are instrumental in what we're doing throughout the course of the year. Next slide, please. Our silver sponsors, anything anyone can need from the industry, be it drilling or data management or any kind of contractors. Again, please feel free to look up any of these folks. Next slide, please. Just a quick rundown of some upcoming events and courses. September 18th, tomorrow, Introduction to New Jersey Resilient Environments and Landscapes, also known as New Jersey REAL, with a few attorneys, LSRPs, and PhD, moderated by Alyssa Naring. October 1st, so in a couple weeks, the next thing in our Aspiring Professional series, in-person drilling techniques and equipment. It's a good one for folks kind of newer to the industry, trying to get their feet wet and learn more about what goes on in the field. October 8th, integrating three-dimensional visualization into conceptual site models. That's with Jason Ruff from S2C2. Next, please. October 10th, something that everyone always needs throughout the course of your 3-year time period for your license, ethics for site remediation professionals. Again, very good panel there to be able to answer any questions that we may have. October 15th, PFAS roundtable. As everyone knows, PFAS, lots of ongoing changes, and it's always good to have a refresher here. Next course, please. Next slide, please. Don't forget, beginning of October 3rd, we have in conjunction with New Jersey SWEP, we have our annual golf outing. It's always good time with everyone, rain or shine, so bring your ponchos if you're going to be out for the day, or just joining us for dinner that evening. Next slide, please. As always, follow us on social media, LinkedIn, X, or Facebook, or any other platforms. Next slide, please. If you're not a member, when you're on this training, please think about doing so as we kind of turn the page to the next year. We're always looking for new members, always looking for people to join committees, help out, conference, classes, all kinds of committees are listed on our website. So please click on the link and join today or ask any questions you may have. Next slide, please. Thank you, and we'll get back to your regular scheduled class here for everybody. So thanks, Julie. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Brad. And thank you everyone for your patience with some of our technical issues this morning. So we've heard from Brad, we've heard from Crystal talking about the intro and contaminants of emerging concern. Now we're going to move on to Carrie Brookhouse, who's going to talk about chapter 3.3, history and use of the site. So Carrie, if you're here, take it away.
Thank you. Good morning. Again, I'm Carrie Brookhouse, Senior Consultant and LSRP with BSI America Professional Services, and I will be discussing section 3.3 today and providing some practical considerations on how to complete research and review of historical site use. Next slide. So section 3.3 reminds the investigator that a review of products used over the history of the site and potential discharge pathways can help identify potential sources of contaminants of emerging concern that would then help in the development and refinement of your conceptual site model. So practically speaking, as shown in the images below, what you might see at your site currently is not what was always there. So it's very important to understand the historical as well as current site uses to better define your areas of concern, your compounds of potential concern, and possible sample locations. Next slide. So where would you start? We did include in Chapter 1 of the Field Sampling Procedures Manual, Section 1.3, a list of sources that could help provide some historical information. There's also the Preliminary Assessment Technical Guidance from the DEP that gives you a really thorough process in how to do a historical search. And then the NJDP Data Miner and GeoWeb are great sources. So in these images with the Data Miner search, if you don't have a PI number or any other kind of state applied case number, you can search on site name, you can search on address, and get information about your site. Some of the images that you can get from data are GeoWeb, parcel information. This image to the far right shows locations of CEAs, deed restrictions. You can get PI numbers, a whole list of the known contaminated sites. And then there's also a layer of historical photographs. So those are really good resources. Next slide. So once you've kind of exhausted what you can do online, the next step you would take is to conduct a site walk or a site inspection. And the Preliminary Assessment Guidance has a checklist that you can follow along for things that you should definitely make sure you look for while you're on site. So throughout this review of historical information, you want to try to answer these questions that are out to the right. What was your site? What were the dates of operation? What was stored and used there? And where was it stored or used? So keep those always in the back of your mind. Things that can help you answer those questions. If you do a title search or business directory search, they can give you information on past ownership. It's important to always kind of keep in mind that the operations and use of your site may have changed several times. You also want to determine, what was the property, a commercial property, residential, or maybe it was both. And then I bolded this. It's important to make note of the years that the property was used for commercial purposes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. If it was a commercial property, you want to try to define it further, and your directory search will help identify, was it industrial, warehousing, manufacturing, retail. Another really good source for historical information, Sanborn fire insurance maps, historical topographic maps, and aerial photos. And these will help you determine the last naturally vegetated state of your property, which is an important piece of information that we'll discuss again on the next slide. Once you have finally identified what your property was, then your next step is going to be to identify what materials were used there. You want to look for both raw materials, waste materials, your chemical storage, location of labs, location of manufacturing plants, processed wastewater, piping and discharge locations. And specific to PFAS investigations, you also want to try to identify any locations of historical fires. This information you can get from completing file reviews, places you might reach out to, NJDEP. You've got the community right to know section. Also look at your municipal and county planning, health departments, and also reach out to the local fire departments. Important to note that if your historical or current uses indicate that you might have contaminants of emerging concern on your site or have been used historically, then they would need to be added to your site investigation. And as previously noted, the information that you gain from this research is going to be used to help select your areas of concern, potential compounds of concern, and your possible sampling locations and what media might be impacted. Next slide. So as I mentioned, it's important to understand your dates of operations, because then you can compare that to dates of manufacturing of the various compounds. Per the NJDP PA guidance, your diligent inquiry should go back to 1932 or before the site was developed and was naturally vegetated, whichever is earlier. So once you start this research, again, the dates are really important. And as you can see here, the ITRC has provided a timeline of PFAS, and it was PFAS chemistry was discovered in the late 1930s and was by the 1950s was being used in many products, both for consumers and by the industry. So the ITRC is also a really good resource. They have these links for compounds and possible uses. Next slide. And again, you can just do a simple internet search to help identify dates when other CECs were developed and widely used. For example, microbeads were patented in the 1960s with widespread use by the 1990s. Commercial scale production of 1,4-dioxane began in 1951. But again, ITRC has provided a great image for the timeline. Important to note that the 1,4-dioxane was originally synthesized back in 1863. Solvents came online in 1921, and then 1,4-dioxane in 1929. So while it wasn't, the commercial use didn't really begin until the 1950s, depending on when your site began operation, just keep in mind that it was a chemical back prior to 51. Next slide. So after you complete your information search, if you find evidence that CECs may have been used at your site, then a site investigation will be necessary. How to set up your investigation and sampling and analytical considerations will be discussed next. One thing I did want to point out is if you do detect CECs in your site groundwater, but your research has found no evidence of use at your site, then it might be necessary for you to expand your search to nearby properties. And in that case, you'd want to refer to the September 2018 off-site source groundwater investigation technical guidance for how to evaluate and document your lines of evidence of potential off-site source migrating onto your site. And to make it just a little bit trickier, it's important to note that CECs may not always appear on safety chemical data sheets or active ingredient lists, and manufacturers might not always be aware of the presence of CECs in their products. So you just have to do your best to try to, do your due diligence. Next slide. All right, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Carrie. I just wanted to remind everybody before we move on to the next speaker, not to wait to put in your questions. If you have a question, enter it into the question box as you have it, and we will answer it during the first Q&A section. So our next speaker is going to be Eileen Snyder to talk about Chapter 3.4. Take it away.
Good morning, everyone. This is Eileen Snyder here from PACE Analytical Services to bring you the laboratory analytical perspective on this topic of contaminants of emerging concern. And just as a reminder, I used to be in your shoes as the data user, as a consultant for about 25 years. Next slide, please. So from the data user and from the laboratory perspective, analytical method selection for remediation standards applications do present challenges, both for the remediation professional and data user and for the laboratory. In our discussion of section 3.4 of chapter 3, we're going to highlight 3 different subsections or topics. We'll end with some key takeaways, and then we'll move into practical considerations. First, we want to take up the analytical method selection considerations themselves. Secondly, we'll discuss certification, lab certification for these methods and target analytes. And then last, analytical interferences that might present challenges to you as the data user. Next slide. So subsection 3.4.1 of section 3.4 in chapter 3 really focuses you on the analytical method selection considerations for contaminants of emerging concern. I want to highlight here, it's so important to discuss in advance of sample collection and field work your project plans with your laboratory. You have some great resources. I believe Crystal was going to put in the chat resources for you to avail yourself to develop your project plans. Those being development of a quality assurance project plan, taking a look at your project communication form, and also looking at other QAP templates that the department has available for you. So in talking to your laboratory about your project, it's important to relay the purpose of your sampling program and the applicable regulatory criteria that you'll need to evaluate your sample analytical data against. Let's take some examples. For site screening, for example, you may say, I'm going to collect groundwater samples. I would like them to be analyzed for PFAS by method 1633, but only report select target analytes. And there's a few here listed. For a second opportunity to go out at your site, you might take a wider look for a complete site characterization. Again, you're collecting groundwater samples, but this time you ask your laboratory to report the full list of 40 target analytes in method 1633 for all of the PFAS target analytes available under that particular method. So then you might move to the site remediation phase of the project. Again, staying with the groundwater example, you might be back to a short list of target analytes. Those are 3 separate scenarios, really important to talk to your laboratory with specificity about not only the sample matrix and the analytical method, but exactly which target analytes you need reported. So in following up with our 4th example with regulatory compliance for potable water or drinking water samples, again, it's important for the PFAS example to mention to your laboratory that you want the drinking water method 537.1, there's also an option to use 533, that you want PFAS target analytes reported and list those analytes that you need reported. Is it a short list of, say, 3 target analytes, or is it a longer list of the full 18 target analytes available under that method? Next slide. Staying on the topic of analytical method selection considerations, there are multiple factors that play into your selection of an analytical method for a list of parameters for contaminants of emerging concern. First, obviously, is the type of samples you're going to collect. Soil, sediment, waste samples are categorized in the certification program as SCM, or solid and chemical materials. Non-potable water samples, NPW, would include groundwater, surface water samples. Drinking water or potable water samples. BT is another certification category the laboratory may have for biological tissue samples. And then last is the air sample matrix, generally for vapor intrusion applications here. Next opportunity for you to talk to your laboratory again is your discussion about your target analyte report list. And again, here be specific. Say, do I want just the regulated short list of target analytes, or do I want the full list of target analytes available to be defined under a particular analytical method? The third topic we want to talk about here, especially with emerging contaminants, is analytical method sensitivity. Examples include drinking water. You may have an MCL, maximum contaminant level, that you need to meet. Or for groundwater, you may have a groundwater quality standard. The laboratory will have a reporting limit for a particular method for target analytes, and you need to evaluate that reporting limit against your regulatory criteria. Then the fourth topic that's really important is laboratory accreditation or certification. There's a couple of options here. There's a state level certification, both at the NELAP level and the state, what we call Blue Book level, for select target analytes and select matrices. Then there's a national NELAP accreditation that you may hold with your primary state of accreditation, and then maybe do a secondary through New Jersey as well. And that may give you an opportunity to be accredited for a longer list of target analytes in multiple matrices. Now, the next topic of interest really here that's important for you as the remediation professional to communicate to your laboratory are your project-specific data quality objectives, DQOs. Here, we're really getting to the heart of why you prepare a quality assurance project plan. It's important to communicate how the data will be used and what your project data quality objectives are to your laboratory in developing your project sampling and analysis plans. And again, the department has provided you with guidance, the analytical methods technical guidance, the 4-part series, a QAP template that the Office of Quality Assurance has available on their website, and then also a project communication form, which kind of summarizes a short list of prompts for you to review in developing your communication plan with your laboratory and your documents for your project. A couple more items here. It's important to talk to your laboratory about what type of report type you need. For example, a New Jersey full is typically considered a CLP style or a level 4 data package. It includes all the raw data, including the sample injection logs, versus a New Jersey reduced data package, which could be summarized as a level 3 data package, does not include all the raw data. So it's important to distinguish between those two before samples are collected and make a notation on your chain of custody form. And then usually your project will require some type of electronic data deliverable, or EDD. For example, the HAZSite EDD for site remediation projects, or the E2 EDD for your potable water, drinking water projects. And then last, again, I want to wrap up with stressing an emphasis on development of project plans and involving your laboratory in that process. Those would include not only the front-end quality assurance project plans, including your sampling and analysis plans, but then also some discussion with your lab about your data usability evaluation plans and your data quality assessment plans. And again, the department has provided guidance for you on those 3 types of plans. Next slide.
Okay, we're doing our first poll question. So analytical method selection considerations include A, sample type, B, analytical method sensitivity, C, project-specific data quality objectives, or D, all of the above. All right, so the answer is D, all of the above. And we'll give it back to you, Eileen.
Very good. Okay, let's move on to our next topic in section 3.4. That would be a subsection focused on analytical method certification. We gave you a bit of a preview. Now we're going to take a deep dive into what that really means. That's important both to the laboratory, this is pretty much the world I live in, or you as the data user and remediation professional. So it's important to talk to your laboratory in advance, again, about your project plans, what parameters you need for your project, what target analytes, what level of sensitivity, etc. Certification for analytical methods in New Jersey is determined by OQA, Office of Quality Assurance. You can refer to the annual certified parameter list, which is part 3 of the certification application. Certification is offered on an initial basis and then a renewal basis. The renewal only lasts for 1 year. Labs have to reapply every year for that renewal. Certification, again, should be evaluated and discussed with your laboratory prior to sample collection and data reporting. It's so important because New Jersey certifies really in detail, much more than many other states. Certified methods may not be available for all types of sample media, all parameters, all contaminants of concern, all target analytes that you want reported under a method, or all types of instrumentation. You can, as a data user and a project planner, initiate a search through the data miner search tool. You can call the Office of Quality Assurance or check the certified parameter list or contact your selected laboratory and have a conversation right up front. It's important for both of you, the remediation professional and the laboratory, to dialogue in advance of sample collection because, again, certification for laboratory testing is offered by sample media type. You know, that, for example, the soil or groundwater, surface water, potable water samples, air, biological tissue. It's offered by parameter. So PFAS, you know, is a group of different target analytes. 1,4-dioxane, for example, is one target analyte. Third, New Jersey does certify by target analyte, by sample media, by instrumentation and laboratory prep, or say extraction. So it's important to really communicate with your laboratory in advance, make sure that they do hold certification for the parameters that you need reported on your project, down to the target analyte. The technique that's used for analytical determination, we generally think about as part of the analytical method or the analysis, the instrument analysis. For example, LCMS-MS is used for PFAS analytical methods, whereas the GCMS is used typically, you know, for your volatile organics, your semis, your pesticide, PCB parameters. So 2 types of accreditation, again, not to get into the weeds here, but the department offers the department-sanctioned analytical methods, or we commonly refer to them as DSAMs. Those are published analytical methods that the department sanctions for use for accreditation directly by that method number and name. Or a second approach is a user-defined approach based on a laboratory SOP for an analytical method that has not yet been published or has been, for example, like PFAS, finalized but not yet promulgated by EPA. Next slide. So moving along, the third subsection in section 3.4 focuses on analytical interferences. that's an important topic for you as the data user. It's important to dialogue with your laboratory in advance about perhaps ways that they could mediate or mitigate challenges associated with processing of your samples. Every analytical method has a section on matrix interferences and possible tools that the laboratory might use to mitigate impacts of those matrix challenges. However, I do want to mention laboratories process samples in an as-received condition. So it's really important to know upfront and dialogue with your laboratory if you expect your samples to cause matrix interferences and present challenges. For example, you may have elevated levels of target and or non-target analytes in your sample. Why would this be important to you? Well, the laboratory may be able to achieve a concentration determination and reporting of some of the target analytes available in the method within a calibration range, but some of the method or target analytes that you need reported exceed that calibration range. So that means that sample has to be reprocessed and almost analyzed twice, and reported twice. The first run, right, would carry the reporting of those target analytes within the calibration range. The second run would be diluted and run again, and those analytes that had initially exceeded the calibration range could be brought within range based on that dilution and reported on that second run. What does that mean to you as the data user? That means you may have elevated reporting limits because of the sample dilution. That's important, especially for your aqueous samples. Next example here, you may have high levels of suspended solids in an aqueous sample, complicating the laboratory's ability to isolate, determine, and provide a sensitivity level for those target analytes. So, for example, your groundwater samples may be collected with high levels of turbidity or total suspended solids. Some analytical methods, such as PFAS 1633, provide the analysts with guidance on how to address turbidity in those samples. And then a third example here in terms of analytical interferences might be the percentage moisture level in your solid samples. Say you're drilling through soil and you're just above that groundwater table, but you happen to be in a saturated zone. The samples that you do want to collect at that soil groundwater interface may be moist or wet. And again, the laboratory is going to process that sample on an as-received basis. The laboratory will determine your percent moisture for your dry weight reporting of that solid sample, but you as the data user may be faced with an elevated reporting limit because of that moisture level in that sample. So again, in summary, interferences may result in elevated reporting limits due to dilutions, multiple runs due to re-extract and or reanalysis of the sample, because of target analytes outside of your calibration range. And then third, and more importantly, more of a dialogue in your case narrative, because you may have reporting of results that are qualified with quality control excursions. So again, just in summary, it's important to be aware that there are impacts potentially on the data usability due to decreased levels of analytical sensitivity, which means conversely elevated reporting limits. An example would be obviously your samples reported with a dilution factor and a raised reporting limit. Carrie had mentioned on the previous slide, one of the previous slides, for example, if you have PFAS that you suspect to be residually left behind because of a fire that had to be addressed in an area, and the responders had to use the AFFF or the firefighting foam. That is a concentration of target analytes and non-targets in that sample. It's important to flag that sample on the chain of custody as potentially hot or high levels of contamination for lab screening. The laboratory would screen it and most likely provide a dilution and an elevated reporting limit to give you some usable data. Next slide. So key takeaways, that's a lot of information, and again, you can go back to these slides and review them, but let's highlight some key takeaways. Conversations with your laboratory for method selection can be complex, should occur in advance during project planning, because selection of analytical methods really is based on multiple factors. Second key point, accreditation is an important topic to discuss with your laboratory in advance of sample collection. New Jersey Office of Quality Assurance does certify laboratories. It's quite a detailed process and based on several factors. And then third, sample matrix interferences may cause challenges to the laboratory in sample processing, and then challenges to you as the data user through, for example, elevated reporting limits or QC excursions. So again, in wrapping up, just discuss in advance with your laboratory your plans to go out to a site, collect samples, and obtain usable data, and discuss that well in advance of containers being ordered and beginning of your field work. Next slide. So now let's put into practice some of these concepts that we just discussed. We're going to use 1,4-dioxane as our first example here, and we're going to talk about stepping through how do you select methods and dialogue with your laboratory. First, it's important to reveal the regulatory program jurisdiction. You know, are you collecting a wastewater sample for permitted discharge? Are you collecting a groundwater sample, for example, soil sample? Are you collecting a potable water sample for drinking water compliance? Secondly, it's important to reveal the remediation standards or regulatory criteria that are applicable to your project. Third, it's important to ask your laboratory, right, whether they can provide analytical method sensitivity that's needed to meet your regulatory criteria. For example, you know, the groundwater quality standards. Analytical method selectivity is needed by the laboratory both for analyte identification and quantitation in a particular sample matrix, recovery of a particular analyte from that sample matrix, uses a sample preparation technique and then an analytical instrumentation approach, and the recovery potential is important to you, finally here, with your data quality needed to achieve your project data quality objectives. Next slide. So again, continuing this same example, for example, let's say the laboratory is selected by the LSRP for a project. Project sampling plans include collection, for example, of groundwater and soil samples for 1,4-dioxane and other parameters. The project team is confident that they know how to place the bottle order. They call the laboratory and proceed. The laboratory then will start to clarify the project scope in greater detail. First, the laboratory will generally dialogue about what is the applicable regulatory program. Example here would be the Contaminated Site Remediation and Redevelopment Program. Secondly, there should be a dialogue about what remediation standards apply for those soil and groundwater samples. And you see regulatory citations here for the soil remediation standards and the groundwater quality standards. And then next, what analytical parameters are requested for your project? What target analytes need to be reported for soil and groundwater samples, in addition to that one target analyte you mentioned initially, which is the 1,4-dioxane. The laboratory will then verify they hold New Jersey certification to report all of the requested target analytes in the sample project matrices, in addition to that one contaminant of emerging concern highlighted. The laboratory will process the bottle order, deliver the containers. The LSRP will collect the samples, samples then are received, logged in, processed, data are reported. Next slide. So then the data user is holding the data and reviews the sample analytical data and determines, as the data user, that yes, the requested analytical parameters did include all of the target analytes of concern, including the 1,4-dioxane contaminant of emerging concern, that contaminant of emerging concern was reported at a level of sensitivity, right, needed to meet the remediation standards applicable to the project. Here you're seeing that the groundwater quality standard that was initially enacted as an interim standard in 2015 and finalized in 2018 as a specific groundwater quality standard. And you're looking at the New Jersey soil remediation standards for the migration to groundwater pathway for 1,4-dioxane. Those were implemented in May 2021. So the LSRP determines then the data are usable to meet the intended project purpose and do in fact meet the project data quality objectives. Then the LSRP moves on to the project laboratory invoice, notes a separate charge for the 1,4-dioxane in groundwater, and asks for an explanation, not recalling why that would be called out as a separate charge. So the laboratory did confirm that they had to use a modified method to achieve the level of sensitivity needed to meet that groundwater quality standard. And that modified method included a GCMS analysis using selected ion monitoring, or SIM, with isotope dilution. And that was important to achieve the level of sensitivity, selectivity, and analyte recovery for 1,4-dioxane to meet the project data quality objectives. Thus, a separate charge is listed for that single analyte in that sample matrix on the project invoice. Next slide. So that's a lot of information, and thank you, and we'll return to this topic later in the talk for the 1,4-dioxane fact sheet.
Thank you so much, Eileen Snyder. Next up is John Bracken, who will discuss Chapter 3.5, General Sampling Considerations. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm John Bracken with Verdantis, a senior consultant in LSRP. The presentation for my section is Chapter 3.5, which is the General Sampling Considerations. With the Chapter 3.5, it focuses on the general considerations that you would want to review for your CECs, understanding your overall sample objectives and any of the special considerations for sampling of CECs, and then what do you do once you've completed your investigation and then you generate waste from that. This chapter is only a couple pages long, but it does include some important reminders and considerations. There have been updates to the CEC fact sheets, which have been provided online and are available through the DEP's websites. And the industry sampling techniques and methods are ongoing, and updates to testing are always continually approved and revised. And the investigator should take care to review the most applicable guidance, available guidance, and it may not always necessarily be things that are available on the DEP's website. There are other sources such as US EPA, ASTM, and the ITRC. Next slide. So we have in Chapter 3.5, we have kind of the 5 main components, which include your sampling objectives and your potential cross-contamination, again, the sequence in which you should collect your samples, decontamination considerations, which also help with Section 3.5.2 and the cross-contamination consideration, and then again, the IDW considerations. Next slide. So with the sampling objectives, what are your project objectives? What are your data quality objectives, your DQOs? So as discussed with Eileen's presentation, items to be considered would be coordinating with your laboratory and understanding your lab's limitations on your method detection limits, your reporting limits. What are your appropriate and current analytical methods that you need to consider. What would be your appropriate bottleware for those methods, and then what would your appropriate hold times be? So as all part of that, you would develop your site-specific, project-specific QAP and include your analyte list, your methods, your media matrix or matrices that you're sampling, and then of course the reporting limits. And all of these are a component of the QAP guidance that's provided in Chapter 2 of the Field Sampling Procedures Manual. And then there's also the guidance that's on the OQA and SRP websites. And then development of these will definitely require that you coordinate with your laboratory in advance. I believe that a lot of the laboratories prefer it that way. Sometimes it's reactionary, but it'll help keep your project on target. The other component that Eileen messaged before in her presentation, which will require intimate lab involvement, is the development of a user-defined analytical approach. So if there isn't a standard or there's something that's not been finalized as an actual formal method, it's in progress, you will need to define that and develop that and put that in your QAP. Again, QAP templates on OQA and the SRP guidance is included in the DEP's websites. Next slide. So with any of your sampling events, potential cross-contamination is a realized and potential concern. Understanding how that's going to compromise your analytical results and the overall outcome of your investigation is paramount. Several laboratories do have cut sheets regarding compounds of emerging concern, such as PFAS with potential cross-contamination. Some examples here for cross-contamination include some of the PPE that you use at sites, some of the sampling equipment are concerns, whether it's rental or owned, or it's a disposable piece of equipment. Some of the personal hygiene and personal care products are also considerations, and food packaging, to say the least. Understanding the type of CEC and potential exposure is extremely helpful in understanding how you manage your field sampling and manage your data quality. Next slide. So in the overall sampling procedures, there is a preferred sampling sequence with most of the contaminants of concern, including media-specific as well. So order of sample collection does matter. It does have a preferred order and sequence. Collecting from known low to high areas of concentration is one of the key sampling sequence. And understanding your site, I recognize that there are some sites that may not have a lot of history. So understanding your site to help with the sampling sequence, developing your conceptual site model, the CSM is extremely important, kind of laying out your sampling, your overall sampling protocols and your sampling procedures. And then if there's existing data, that's extremely helpful, of course, and understanding if there's known concentrations that then you can identify and then develop your work plan and sampling protocol around. With media specific, you have sampling sequence with sampling potable water first. So for any folks that do sampling of potable water and you're doing it in conjunction with another sampling event, you're sampling soil or groundwater or sediment or air, you would want to sample your potable water first, and then you would want to keep those potable waters separate from other media. The analyte sampling sequence is included in Chapter 6 of the Field Sampling Procedures Manual, and it is preferred that you do, if you are sampling for PFAS, that PFAS is collected initially, and that will also be discussed in the PFAS fact sheet by Jen Lomson. And then if you do sample for other parameters beyond PFAS, there is a sequence with that as well. Next slide. So managing your cross-contamination with any project, you're going to want to take into consideration keeping the sampling equipment and reducing the potential for outliers with conducting decontamination. So in Chapter 5, there is the decon procedures that's outlined. Decontamination, is paramount to keeping your samples free from exterior sources and understanding where you're getting interference, and especially considerations, with rental equipment. You don't know where that piece of equipment has been before. It may have come in contact with some gross contamination, so you want to try and minimize the potential effects of some external sources on your sampling event. Field sampling can also be evaluated with doing field and equipment blanks. That is also a key indication of how good your decontamination is actually being implemented. Another consideration is your decon cleaning supplies, and they should be evaluated for whether or not they have PFAS-free or detergents that contain other contaminants that you're sampling for. Next slide. So once you've developed, your whole entire sampling investigation, you start generating waste. You're going to have to evaluate and characterize your waste for proper disposal. So understanding your disposal facility limitations is paramount. Understanding if your client has disposal restrictions, and then understanding if there's federal and local disposal restriction requirements. Next slide. So case example here is typical industrial commercial site with soil and groundwater investigations. Have you done your due diligence? Is there a pre-existing site history? Do you understand if you have CECs and whether or not there is potential for CECs? As Carrie mentioned, understanding the history and the site use is pretty paramount. Take a closer look at your operational timelines as they may overlap with CECs or predate or postdate some CEC usage. Next slide. So understanding your site, are there known areas of concern? So have you done a preliminary assessment, due diligence? Are there suspected areas of concern? Do you understand the operational history of the site, and have there been some discharges? So what type of sampling would be performed? What type of sampling equipment would you need to use? So you need to take into consideration, again, some of the cross-contamination, some of the decontamination considerations, what type of personal protective equipment would be necessary, and then how will that interact with your overall sampling protocol, and is there a concern for cross-contamination? And then again, how will you set up your overall program and considerations for decontamination to reduce some of those risks? Next slide. So understanding, and you're in this example of the case study, is there a known sequence? So have you identified hotspots? Have you identified areas of concern in which there is potential for high or gross contamination? And then you would set your sampling sequence in order to minimize that and sample from your low to your high. Have there been previous investigations that have identified that? And understanding the site conditions and the operations and figuring out where the likely areas of contamination would be a good understanding for your site layout and your CSM. And then how will you manage your cross-contamination? How will you minimize potential for some of these outliers or external factors? Next slide. So once you go through and you understand your whole entire site conceptual model, you understand, you implement your field sampling, and you minimize your cross-contamination, you implement your decon, and you try and maximize the amount of data that you can collect on the site, and keep it as quality assurance as possible, you'll have waste. And how is that waste going to be generated? So will disposal be necessary? Have the IDW materials been characterized? What would you have to sample for? Do you understand what CECs that you'll be generating? And then what are the disposal facility limitations that could potentially prevent you from sending certain waste to certain facilities? And as I mentioned before, there's certain limitations from local, state, federal, and potentially some client-related restrictions that need to be considered. Next slide. And with that,
thank you, John. All right, so our next presenter is going to be Crystal, back again to talk about PFAS sampling fact sheet, and she's going to be joined by Dr. Jennifer Williamson in just a little bit to talk more about the details of the fact sheet. So go ahead, Crystal.
Thank you, Jillian. Again, my name is Crystal Prozik, and we are going to go over the PFAS sampling fact sheet. Next slide. As discussed thus far, Chapter 3 is a general discussion on aspects of CECs. Detailed information for different contaminants was decided to be included in sampling fact sheets. The main reason for this was the ease in updating and adding fact sheets and not having to edit the entire field sampling procedures manual to reflect changes. The first fact sheet the team was tasked to create was PFAS. Shown here is an image of the sampling fact sheet and also a link. It can be found on the field sampling website, the CEC page, as well as in your handouts today. Along with adding the PFAS fact sheet to the web page, we have also started updating the CEC website. Jennifer will now discuss the specifics of the PFAS sampling fact sheet. Next slide.
Thank you, Crystal. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Williamson, and I'm a research scientist in the Bureau of Environmental Evaluation and Risk Assessment at DEP. Today, I'll be providing an overview of the PFAS sampling fact sheet. There is a lot of detail in this fact sheet, so if you've not already done so, I would encourage you to take a look at that document after this training. The fact sheet begins with a brief overview of what are PFAS and then focuses on a number of analytical and sampling considerations. I'll begin today with the discussion of analytical methods, and much of this will be reiterating the considerations that both Eileen and John discussed earlier in this training. The selection of an analytical method for PFAS compounds can be complex and should be done in consultation with your selected certified laboratory. You should also develop a quality assurance project plan. As mentioned earlier, the Office of Quality Assurance has both a QUAP template and QUAP checklist on their website, and the PFAS fact sheet includes a link to this website. PFAS-specific selection considerations include your sample matrix of interest, laboratory certification. You should select a certified laboratory. A full list of PFAS-certified labs and PFAS-certified methods can be found on the department's Data Miner website. Your desired analyte report list. Different PFAS methods can have different analyte report lists, and you want to ensure that you select a method that has your target analytes. You also want to consider analytical sensitivity to ensure that you have the necessary sensitivity to meet regulatory criteria, and also consider that different methods may have different sample preparation protocols. The chart here shown on the right is included in the PFAS fact sheet and includes additional details on methods for PFAS in drinking water, PFAS in aqueous non-potable water such as groundwater, surface water, and wastewater, and solid and chemical materials as well. We also note that the department is requesting that you report all compounds detected by a given method. So for instance, if you're running 1633 to report all 40 compounds to the department, this is incredibly helpful when determining source identification. Next slide, please. Moving on now to general sampling considerations for PFAS compounds. As John mentioned earlier in his presentation, cross-contamination and preventing this is a major consideration for PFAS compounds due to their widespread use in a variety of products and materials. Potential sources of both direct and indirect cross-contamination should be identified and avoided to the extent practicable. The fact sheet puts a specific emphasis on avoiding sources of direct contamination, so things that will come into direct contact with your sample. Potential sources of cross-contamination include, but are not limited to, decontamination in drilling water, your sampling materials and equipment, so think the tubing, your sampling container, field clothing, personal care products, and food packaging. Next slide, please. Some additional general sampling considerations. You should follow sampling best practices. You should have clean gloves, clean hands, minimize the handling of samples and equipment, avoid touching the sample, the inside of the sample bottle, and the inside of the sample lid. If you have to do decontamination, ensure that you are using PFAS-free soap and water. And another very important consideration is the collection of field blanks. These should be dictated by your data quality objectives and are especially important if you are using non-dedicated sampling equipment or materials not known to be PFAS-free. Next slide, please. So the previous slides were discussing how to prevent the addition of PFAS into your sample, but it is equally important to avoid the loss of PFAS from your sample. Certain materials have been shown to absorb PFAS compounds, therefore resulting in a negative bias. In order to avoid this, you should make sure that you are always using appropriate sampling equipment and containers. The containers are dictated by your selected analytical method and in most instances should be provided by the laboratory. In addition, you should not filter your samples as PFAS compounds may be retained by the filter. Also ensure that you follow appropriate sample preservation requirements. Next slide, please. The next section of the fact sheet goes into more detail on media-specific sampling considerations. I'll begin here today with groundwater-specific considerations. This includes material considerations for monitoring well construction. PVC and stainless steel are acceptable materials. Hydraulic profiling tools and pre-packed well screens may be used if they are certified to be PFAS-free. The fact sheet also notes that PFAS have been detected in some coated or time-released bentonite pellets and some drilling lubricants. So ensure that you consult with your driller to make sure that you are using PFAS-free materials in this process. Next slide, please. Continuing with groundwater, PFAS are considered to be a turbidity-sensitive parameter. Some PFAS compounds do have a tendency to accumulate in sediments. The volume average sampling policy in Chapter 6 of the Department's Field Sampling Procedures Manual does not apply when sampling is limited to non-volatile turbidity-sensitive parameters. For PFAS compounds, low flow or passive sampling methods are preferred. However, traditional volume average sampling can be used if turbidity levels below 10 NTU can be obtained. Once again, samples should not be filtered, and temporary well points should be developed before sample collection, and pre-packed well screens are recommended here. Next slide, please. The fact sheet goes into detail about sampling materials. Note that this is not an all-inclusive list, but you'll see that in many instances, HDPE and silicone are the recommended materials. We note that materials not referenced here in the fact sheet may be used if the manufacturer certifies them to be PFAS-free, or if field blanks or soak testing shows no PFAS. Balers are generally not recommended due to the inability to control turbidity. And the fact sheet also discusses how to evaluate the potential for PFAS cross-contaminated at a site with pre-existing dedicated pumps and related equipment. So if you have a site that has pre-existing equipment, I would encourage you to take a look at the fact sheet. Next slide, please. Moving away from groundwater now to surface water. For surface water, traditional methods and equipment are generally applicable. However, you should avoid the collection of foams when collecting your sample and minimize sediment disturbance. Once again, this is due to the ability of PFAS compounds to accumulate in sediments. For soil and sediment sampling, the main consideration is using acceptable materials to avoid PFAS cross-contamination. We also note that on a site-specific basis, due to the timing of your discharge, your soil type, and other considerations, you may need to consider collecting samples at multiple depth intervals. This is because PFAS compounds can leach throughout the soil columns, and you want to ensure that you are capturing the soil contamination at a site. For air, there are currently no validated analytical methods or standards, and therefore the fact sheet does not go into detail about air. However, we note that the department will continue to monitor analytical and scientific developments with relation to air and will update the fact sheet as appropriate moving forward. Next slide, please. Now, next up is sampling sequence. This should be planned in advance of your sampling event. If possible, PFAS should be sampled as a standalone event in order to minimize the chances of cross-contamination. However, if this is not possible, PFAS should be sampled before other contaminants. And then, as mentioned earlier by John, samples should proceed from low impact areas to high impact areas, and potable water samples should be collected before other media. Next slide, please. And it looks like we have a poll question.
We do indeed. So, next slide, please. You'll have a minute to answer this question. If sampling multiple media for PFAS analysis, when should you sample potable water? A, first, B, last, or C, it doesn't matter. Okay, next slide. The answer is first, and it seems like most of you got that correct. Next slide, please.
Okay, moving on now with decontamination considerations. For PFAS sampling, single-use equipment is recommended when possible. Once again, this is to minimize cross-contamination potential. However, we recognize that this is not always feasible. And therefore, if you are using non-dedicated equipment that needs to be decontaminated, you should ensure that you are using PFAS-free soap or detergent and PFAS-free water. Make sure you indicate where this PFAS-free water is coming from. In cases of gross contamination, you may want to also consider a methanol rinse as well. Next slide, please. And lastly, the fact sheet discusses investigation-derived waste disposal. We do recognize that facilities may have limitations and restrictions for PFAS materials and that this is a challenge. Waste classification sampling to evaluate your handling and disposal options should also be conducted for PFAS compounds. Next slide, please. And lastly, I want to also mention that throughout the fact sheet, there are a number of links to additional sources of information. So if there's more detail, if you need more detail on a certain topic, I encourage you to check out those links. And we also include the table that I am showing here, which lists the topics discussed in the PFAS fact sheets and their corresponding sections in the Field Sampling Procedures Manual. And before I end, I also want to note that in addition to this fact sheet, we are planning to update the Contaminants of Emerging Concern FAQs. There's an old version currently on the website, and we are working to update that, so keep an eye out for that in the future as well. Next slide, please. And with that, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much to Crystal Pirzak and Dr. Jennifer Williamson. Crystal's going to introduce the next slide.
Thank you. Next slide. The second sampling fact sheet the team was asked to create is 1,4-dioxane. The fact sheet again can be found on the field sampling webpage, the CEC page, and in the handouts for today. John and Eileen will now discuss the specifics that are detailed in this sampling fact sheet.
Hello again. This is the 1,4-dioxane sampling fact sheet. So what is 1,4-dioxane? It's a synthetic organic compound primarily used as a stabilizer for 1,1-TCA in the industry. It's been used in various industrial products and formulation for paints and dyes, personal care products, pharmaceutical, biotech, and in the automotive and aviation industry, with antifreezes and things of that nature. One of the other things that 1,4-dioxane is generated is as a byproduct through chemical processes from manufacturing, such as certain plastics, certain polyethylene glycol production, and then in the consumer and industrial detergents and cleaning compounds, which can generate 1,4-dioxane. Next slide. So how does 1,4-dioxane behave? It's a colorless liquid with a density slightly greater than water. It's very marginally more dense than water, but it could also be a solid at certain colder temperatures, which was kind of interesting when I was doing the research on this. It is completely miscible in water, so it does have a high solubility and can mix with water readily, which makes it beneficial from trying not having a separate layer. Due to its miscibility, it will not create a napple layer. However, it can be captured in a denapple layer if it is mixed with some of the other chlorinated solvents that is associated with. But it is highly mobile because it is miscible with water, so it will tend to move through the water column readily. It has a relatively short half-life in air, about 1 to 3 days, but it is relatively resistant to biodegradation in water and soil. And with that, I'll turn it over to Eileen, and she'll go into some of the analytical methods to sample for 1,4-dioxane.
Yep, thank you, John. So this is Eileen Snyder back with you from PACE Analytical to talk about sort of the laboratory or analytical methods selection piece of this topic. Again, staying on the 1,4-dioxane sampling fact sheet, we do have a table in here that is a summary of commonly used approaches, right, for the site remediation program to analyze for 1,4-dioxane in soil and groundwater sample matrices, as well as the drinking water sample matrix. So again, it's so important to consult with your laboratory in advance of sample collection to plan your project. Analytical method selection is complex, can be difficult and challenging, especially for 1,4-dioxane. Development of a quality assurance project plan is recommended, highly recommended. There are multiple sources to assist you in that task. As we've mentioned, and I believe they were put in the chat, links to the Contaminated Site Remediation and Redevelopment Program guidance library, where the analytical methods QA/QC documents live, and then also a link to the Office of Quality Assurance webpage, where Dr. Williamson mentioned there is a QAP template and a QAP checklist. So again, lots of resources for you to develop your project plans and talk about specific topics with your laboratory in selecting a method for 1,4-dioxane. Selection considerations for analytical methods include discussion of your sample matrix, your laboratory's certification for reporting this one target analyte in your selected sample matrix, your analyte report list that's important for the range of parameters that you need to be collecting for your project. And most important, the analytical sensitivity, the sensitivity that the laboratory can provide you with their analytical approach to meet your project data quality objectives. So that analytical selectivity and sensitivity could be based on a modified method, which might include the selected ion monitoring or SIM mode of a GCMS instrument. It also might include the use of isotope dilution. The sample preparation protocols are important to you as the field sampler as well. For example, in New Jersey, for a volatile approach for soil samples, collection using the EPA method 5035 or TerraCore and Encore approach is required. Next slide, please. So taking the first example, sample matrix, and discussing that little detail here, the aqueous sample matrix analytical method selection is important really to achieve that method sensitivity, that reporting limit that you're going to need to meet your project data quality objectives. On the laboratory end, and from your end as the data user, the analyte recovery potential of the selected analytical approach is going to be important for data quality. The ability of that selected analytical approach to achieve your method-defined quality control criteria, commonly known as data of known quality protocols. And then also the use of a modified method. We mentioned SIM, or selected ion monitoring mode of the GCMS. Another tool a laboratory might use as a modification would be the use of isotope dilution for analyte recovery correction to improve your data quality. Next slide. So moving to the soil and sediment sample matrix, you do have two choices, the volatile organic approach using method 8260 or the semi-volatile organic approach using method 8270. I want to make a note that even though EPA, with their target compound list, moved 1,4-dioxane from a VOA target compound list to a semi-VOA target compound list, way back in 2013, the analytical method published by EPA as 8260, the VOA approach, lists 1,4-dioxane as a target analyte in that method. Since these are performance-based methods contained in the compendium SW846, the 8270 or semi-volatile approach can also be used to determine 1,4-dioxane. It is commonly used for the soil application as well. So both of these GCMS approaches, VOA and semi-VOA, can be used in full scan mode, and that's typically going to report data at a sensitivity level to meet your soil remediation standards. Your laboratory may use SIM or selected ion monitoring as an option, again, to improve the method performance. So as discussed prior, percent moisture levels in your solid sample will impact sensitivity. And for you as the data user, that might mean an elevation in your reporting limit. And then finally, as mentioned, collection of soil and sediment samples in New Jersey requires the use of EPA method 5035 with the Encore or TerraCore sampling collection devices. Next slide. So 1,4-dioxane in air. What does that mean to you as the data requester and data user, or sample requester and data user? EPA method TO15 in a full scan mode is typically used for determination of 1,4-dioxane in air in New Jersey. It is on the New Jersey required analyte report list for TO15. This means to you as the field sampling team, you're going to be using the canister and flow controller collection media. And again, this is typically used for vapor intrusion applications. Next slide. So again, in review, analytical method selection for this particular contaminant of emerging concern, 1,4-dioxane, can be complex and depends entirely on your project data quality objectives. It's so important for the LSRP and the laboratory to discuss the project scope in advance and select an approach that actually meets the project-specific data quality objectives. Analytical approach options, as were reviewed, include your volatile organic approach using method 8260, which is a purge and trap preparation and a GCMS analysis. Second approach could be using the semi-volatile organic approach with method 8270 using an organic extraction, excuse me, a GCMS analytical approach. And then for your air sample matrices, you're going to be using the TO15 canister collection with the GCMS analysis, and that's typically used for your vapor intrusion applications. Next slide. So again, in detail, it's so important to talk to your laboratory in advance. Method selection includes a lot of options and a lot of choices. In review, we've summarized the volatile organic approach based on method 8260 with an option for selected ion monitoring added, your middle bullet, and then your third bullet lists 8260 SIM, selected ion monitoring, with isotope dilution added for your analyte recovery correction. Moving to a second approach, that would be your semi-volatile organic approach. Three options include using 8270 method with the GCMS in full scan, 8270 method with the GCMS in SIM or selected ion monitoring mode, and then finally GCMS SIM with isotope dilution for recovery correction. Specificity is important in planning your project, talking to your lab in advance about certification, method sensitivity, and your data quality objectives. And then wrapping up with our air sample matrix, you're going to be selecting the TO15 analytical method, which is a GCMS analysis in full scan mode, and using your canister and flow controller collection for air sample matrices for those vapor intrusion applications. Next slide. So again, it's important in wrapping up for the LSRP and the project team to work with the laboratory in advance to clarify your project scope. In review, what are the applicable regulatory program requirements? For example, the Contaminated Site Remediation and Redevelopment Program. What specific remediation standards apply to each of your sample media? Example would be the soil remediation standards and the groundwater quality standards. Third, your laboratory will generally want to know what additional parameters beyond 1,4-dioxane are requested and what are the full range of target analytes that you need reported in both your soil and groundwater sample matrices for your project. The laboratory will then, and it's important for you as the data user to know, they verified that they hold New Jersey certification to report the range of requested target analytes in each of those project sample matrices. The laboratory will then verify the analytical approach needed to achieve the analytical sensitivity, selectivity, and analyte recovery needed to meet the project-specific data quality objectives. Next slide. And in review, it's important to work with your laboratory in advance to develop that approach, to document that approach, and to review that approach prior to sample collection. Analytical parameters and target analytes of concern should be listed by your laboratory with the corresponding reporting limits and method detection limits, or RLs and MDLs. The 1,4-dioxane can be reported with a range of different analytical approaches. It's important to confirm with your laboratory in advance that they can achieve the level of sensitivity needed to meet your applicable remediation standards. The laboratory will then confirm the exact approach they're using. Perhaps it is a modified method approach with isotope dilution and selected ion monitoring mode for the GCMS that would be used to analyze and report 1,4-dioxane as a single target analyte, right, to achieve your sensitivity, selectivity, and analyte recovery to meet your project data quality objectives. The LSRP then documents that information in their project quality assurance project plan. Next slide. Back to John.
Okay, so one of the common themes I think everybody's kind of understanding is planning is paramount, and understanding your sampling sequence and your CSM is critical. So how do you develop your QAP? How do you coordinate it with your lab? And then understanding your overall low to high concentration gradient, if that's possible, to develop your plan and your sequence in advance is critical. So when you're developing your sampling sequence, based on your analytical targets, are you sampling for 1,4-dioxane as part of other chemical groups? Are you sampling for VOCs? Do you have any other VOCs that you're targeting? Or are you only sampling for SVOCs? And do you want to analyze 1,4-dioxane as a VOC or as part of the full SVOC analysis? And then the other question that you need to ask is, do you need to do SIM to meet your method detection and reporting limits to understand the concentrations at meeting a standard, whether it's soil remediation standards or groundwater quality standards or the like? Are you collecting other media? So as mentioned before, are you collecting potable water? Those should be collected before other media. And then are you doing a different developed sampling approach for a site-specific analysis that has to be developed? So you do need to take all those things into consideration when you're developing your sampling sequence. Next slide. And as mentioned before, with any of the other sampling investigations, decontamination is critical. So using single-use equipment is recommended when possible. That'll help reduce the amount of decontamination, cross-contamination. Non-dedicated equipment decontamination procedures, as mentioned before, there's an entire series of steps for decontamination. You do want to take into consideration using detergents that do not have 1,4-dioxane if that is a compound that you're analyzing for. There are certain liquid detergents with surfactant ingredients that can have trace impurities of 1,4-dioxane. There are other detergents, powder form, and readily available decon that do not have 1,4-dioxane or other contaminants that are present, so you do need to take that into consideration. Similarly, you do need to take into consideration that you have a clean water rinse material that is contaminant free. Specifically, you're sampling for 1,4-dioxane. You do not want that in there. And then other solvents as part of your decontamination process can be considered, such as methanol. Next slide. And then once everything has been investigated and sampled, are you generating waste? And again, similar to other sections in the presentation, do you understand your facilities that can accept this waste? Do they have restrictions and limitations? Have you completed the appropriate waste classification and characterization to be able to obtain a disposal approval and a profile? And then are the waste materials being shipped by an appropriate licensed hauler that can handle those types of waste, and then being disposed of in accordance with appropriate regulations and laws. Next slide. And with that, presentation is complete.
Thank you so much, John and Eileen. So now we're going to move on to our first Q&A segment. We had 25 minutes planned. Unfortunately, since we're running late, that's going to be cut shorter. So we're going to do as many questions as we can in the next 10 minutes so we can keep to the rest of the schedule. If we have more questions than we can get to, if our field sampling procedures manual folks can stay on until the end of the training, maybe we can get to some more at the end. And if we say later than 12:30 and you have to go, that's fine. You'll still get credit if you leave at 12:30. But the answers will be on the recording. That will be on our website. And maybe that's a good compromise. So with that, let's just get started with some of the questions we have. The first question is, can you expand on the slide about next-gen chemicals, PFOA to Gen X? What is Gen X?
I can touch on that. So Gen X is a trade name for hexafluoropropylene oxide dimer acid and its ammonium salt. This was developed by DuPont in, I believe, the late 2000s to make fluoropolymers without PFOA, which was being phased out at that time. And I do want to note that the department does now have interim groundwater and soil remediation standards for Gen X.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. Okay, so the next question is, outside of a preliminary assessment requirement, what else would trigger an evaluation of historical site use? That might be a question for Carrie, I think.
So typically there is a recommendation in Chapter 1 of the Field Sampling Procedures Manual that you would want to do a preliminary assessment first if it's a new site that you're just getting. However, I know, it's a recommendation. So I checked Section 3.1 of the technical requirements for site remediation does state that a preliminary assessment would be required. One, if it's an ISRA site that you've submitted a general information notice for. If you would like a final remediation document for your entire site, a PA is required. If you're remediating a site or portion of a site that's going to be used for child care center or public school, private school, etc. And again, additional, I think, requirements just for child care centers overall to get your license. And then obviously if you're required to do so by the court. But I think what's important to remember about it is really the preliminary assessment or the historical search is there to help you define what it is you need to investigate at your site to help develop your conceptual site model.
Okay, great. So our next question might be for you too, Carrie. What AOCs and historic site uses are indicative of contaminants of emerging concern?
So one of the links I had included in my slide from the ITRC, they have a table on their website, table 2.6 it looks like. And on that table, they do list all the industries and potential PFAS types that industry might have used PFAS. And I think probably from the slides after mine, you did, when we talked about cross-contamination, there were some suggestive things. So you might look at, if you know that you had cosmetic or personal care products manufactured at your site, anything to do with waterproofing, could be a clothing manufacturer, a boot maker, what else? I mean, I think we all probably understand it's pretty pervasive in our environment. So, but definitely that table. And then I think a good point too to note is obviously at this point, we don't necessarily know everything just because they are emerging contaminants and research is still being conducted. But definitely check out that ITRC table for more information.
Cool, thank you, Carrie. Okay, so the next question is, are department-sanctioned analytical methods for PFAS compounds? Not sure who that would be for. Okay.
Yeah, this is Eileen Snyder. Hi, from the lab end of it. I can take that question. So a DSAM, a department-sanctioned analytical method, is typically a method that's EPA published and, if need be, also promulgated. So, for example, the drinking water methods, 537.1, 533, are DSAMs. So they show up on a laboratory certification as an actual method number, 537.1, 533. However, method 1633, or a lab modified method, will show up as a user-defined method. So therein lies the challenge if you're searching on DataMiner, right, for a particular PFAS method. You may not find it as 1633 because that might be listed on the laboratory certification as their SOP number. So you can search in DataMiner based on target analyte and see what analytical methods the lab is certified for, or call your lab. So again, in review, a DSAM is a department-sanctioned analytical method. Published EPA methods generally qualify, but in some cases, the method may need to be promulgated, published in the Federal Register, after a public comment period, etc. That is the case with 1633, even though it's final and posted on the EPA website as final, it is still certified by the department as a user-defined approach until it becomes promulgated by EPA. Hope that explains it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Eileen. I think the next question is probably for you too. How often are laboratory certifications updated? For long-term projects, is there a prescribed frequency the environmental professional should confirm laboratory accreditation for target analytes?
Yep, that's a great question. So the department, OQA, Office of Quality Assurance, offers accreditation for a one-year basis. They start the accreditation cycle on July 1 of every year. Laboratories apply in advance. They generally receive their certification in advance such that they can continue reporting data. So it's important to check with your laboratory yearly and ask them for their current accreditation. And again, July 1 is the start date for each cycle.
Awesome. Okay, and I think the next one is for you too. The analytical section 3.4 discussion used PFAS analysis as an example and discussed elevated reporting limits due to high concentrations and sample dilutions. Does Eileen or DEP have an opinion/preference for diluting PFAS samples versus re-extracting with a smaller volume due to concerns about potentially losing the ability to quantitate the isotope dilution standards when extracts are diluted?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I mean, that's kind of the tricky challenge that the laboratory has with any target analyte, in particular with PFAS, because we have compounds that are quite honestly ubiquitous, right, in the environment, and the sampling environment, and the sensitivity level achieved by those analytical methods are quite low. We're down in the, for aqueous, in the nanogram per liter reporting limits. So it's easy to experience, for the laboratory to experience samples where you may have target analytes that need to be quantified, but they show up outside that calibration range. So trying to use a smaller sample size, if you isolate, concentrate, and put that on the instrument, you're still delivering the same amount of mass onto that instrument. So laboratories think about it not only in sample volume, but the mass of material that's put onto the instrument. So the laboratory might have a few options. Again, with the drinking water methods, please keep in mind EPA 537.1 and 533. Any drinking water method is a prescribed method, cannot be modified by the laboratory, right? Cannot be modified. However, with 1633, which is a performance-based method, the laboratory may have some method modifications available, different volumes, different levels of concentration. So that's a point of discussion, with your laboratory, again, in advance of your field sample collection during your project planning, if you expect to encounter areas where your samples might contain elevated concentrations of those target analytes.
Okay, great. And speaking of methods 1633, the next question talks about it. So the fact sheet indicates that for method 1633, soil samples 2 by 8 ounce bottles are required. Have had multiple labs tell me that they only need 4 ounces. Can you discuss the discrepancy? Is this a deviation? Can the data be considered accurate?
So the tables that are listed in the 2 fact sheets, right, for 1,4-dioxane and for PFAS, the fact sheets, they're example tables. They're not meant to give you the level of specificity that you would find in a drinking water method, because we have methods in there for the SW846 compendium and beyond that are performance-based methods. That means the laboratory may modify the methods, may modify the volume of material, sampling materials that are needed to meet, their quality control criteria and their method sensitivity. So that means it's important to talk to your laboratory in advance, find out what sample volume they do require for the particular method they're running. For PFAS, even if it is method 1633, again, there's variation in the sample volumes that different laboratories are they're basing their method on. The table is meant to be an example. So it's important to talk to your lab in advance, get an understanding of the containers they'll be sending you, the sample volume that's required to fill those containers, to ship them back to that particular selected lab for that lab to process those samples in their analytical system based on their SOP.
Okay, great. Thank you, Eileen. So we have only 3 more minutes for this particular Q&A. I'll ask 1 or 2 more. Should a sample be collected of the potable water used by a driller during the installation of a monitoring well? That might be for John. Sure.
Sure. I mean, if there's a concern with the quality of the water that is being supplied by the drillers or for decon or for any of those considerations, it would be a good idea to understand what the quality or potential cross-contamination sources could be, and you can collect a sample to rule those out. If you're seeing some data that doesn't make sense, it's not necessarily coming from your site, it could be an external source, and that would be a good idea to validate.
Cool, thanks, John. Okay, next question is, traditionally we have sampled VOCs first. When we're sampling for both PFAS and VOCs, should PFAS be first?
I can speak to that quickly, and then, or John, if you want to take it.
Sure. So go ahead, Jen.
Yeah, no, so I was just going to say the fact sheet does discuss this in a bit more detail than was presented today, so I can actually read that. So it says, ideally, sampling for PFAS should be a separate or standalone event to avoid cross-contamination. This is especially true when sampling for co-contaminants requires the use of fluoropolymer materials, for example, Teflon for VOCs. So we would strongly encourage standalone sampling if you're doing both PFAS and VOCs. However, if sampling for PFAS and other contaminants will be conducted during the same event, PFAS samples should be collected first. John, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, it really just comes down to understanding the potential external factors in the cross-contamination. And then again, whether you're using dedicated equipment, non-dedicated equipment, and what is that equipment made of? And is there a potential source from PPE or other external factors? So that's really the focus of the sampling sequence. It's not to say that you can't switch things around, but it is highly advisable in taking a look at all of your chemical groups, and try and get the best possible data for your site.
Okay, great. I'm going to squeeze in one more question here because it's 10:59. So moisture content affects MDL or RL for 1,4-dioxane. Is this for both methods 8260 and 8270?
Sorry. Yes, this is Eileen Snyder again. Yes. Any method, especially your organic methods, your percent moisture in the sample, and again, laboratories process samples on an as-received basis. The percent moisture in a volatile organic approach and a semi-volatile organic approach will impact your sensitivity and your reporting limits.
Cool. Thanks, Eileen. Okay, at this point, we're going to end the Q&A. So Tyrone, if you can go to the next slide. We're going to begin our break from 11 to 11:15. So please feel free to step away. We'll start promptly again at 11:15. Thank you.
Okay, it's 11:15, so we're going to be moving on to the second half of our training, discussing the attainment guidance. So next up is Greg Newman to introduce the topic.
Good afternoon, anybody. My name is Greg Newman. I'm with the Bureau of Environmental Evaluation and Risk Assessment. I was chair of the Attainment Committee, so I'm here to introduce today's training regarding the revision of the attainment guidance from version 2 to version 3. Like past documents, the attainment guidance was actually revised by the Attainment Committee, via the stakeholder process, which was through a collaborative effort. A lot of time and effort went into, the revision. We had several virtual meetings that almost lasted a full year. And at this point, I just want to thank the committee members for their participation and hard work. On the department side, we had Branko Trifunovic and Alex Iannone of BIRA. And our external members consisted of Adam Hackenberg from Langen, James Kearns from Kinder Morgan, Steve Poston from WSP, and Ted Toscas from Jacobs. Next slide, please. Okay, now onto the training, where I'm going to provide a brief overview, basically going over the introduction and some structural changes to the document. Next slide. Just a quick overview. We basically broke up this training into four main topics. We have the introduction, as well as some structural changes. Second, we're going to cover some revisions to the guidance document to address some common issues that the department encounters while we're conducting our reviews. Third, we're going to present some new material regarding new provisions of the guidance document. And lastly, we're going to have a section that discusses some revisions to address guidance inconsistencies that were present in the last version. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of structural changes to the guidance document, the compliance averaging methodologies were actually previously located in Appendix A of version 2. Since these methodologies are really an integral part of the guidance document, we've relocated them to the main body of the document, and they can be found in Section 12. Section 12 also includes guidance on the proper development of functional areas. And within this section, we describe the proper application of the compliance averaging methods, namely arithmetic mean, the 95% upper confidence level of the mean, spatially weighted averaging, and the 75% 10x option. We have a new section, which can be found in section 12.5, which deals with the averaging for historic fill. We have a new Appendix A in terms of content, where we discuss the data deliverables that need to be submitted when conducting compliance averaging, along with some examples. And we have a new Appendix C, which covers non-detect values and how to address them in data sets where compliance averaging is utilized. Next slide, please. Section 12.15 is also, a new section where we provide some new material. Section 12.1.5 deals with the development of functional areas in conjunction with an alternate remediation standard. And Section 12.6, which is our 75-10x option, we provided some clarifying text, if you will, and identify concerns when this option is utilized near a property boundary. Next slide. Okay, on to revisions to the guidance to address some common issues observed during department review. Next slide. Okay, so there are two topics we really wanted to hone in on here. The first is delineation and the related maps that we're looking for. And the second, we wanted to provide some clarity on the data deliverables that you need when submitting a compliance averaging submission. Next slide. Okay, delineation. I just wanted to give everybody a reminder in terms of what the regulatory requirements are. So delineation to the residential and non-residential, as well as the migration to groundwater soil remediation standard, is a tech reg requirement that can be found at 4.2A, 1, 2, and 3. Additionally, the department provided a clarifying statement that was dated January 2020, what we call a policy statement, and it was titled, "The interpretation of the technical requirements for site remediation requirements to complete the remedial investigation." And I have a screenshot here, and what this basically states is that the remedial investigation does not need to include actual clean zone sampling data to demonstrate contaminant delineation to the applicable standard. However, such sampling data are required to demonstrate attainment of the applicable remediation standard at the conclusion of the remedial action and prior to the department issuing an RAO. So what does this mean? What this means is that compliance averaging is a remedial action. It's basically how you're addressing your contaminants that exceed, the relevant standard. So complete delineation on a sample-by-sample basis is required to utilize it. Next slide. So why is delineation so important? So delineation is critical to ensure that the concentrations that are being averaged accurately reflect what the receptor is being exposed to. Sample points that are not delineated and the area beyond them basically represent an unknown, and you can't just assume that the contaminant concentrations actually decrease, moving away from those samples. As anybody who knows has worked in the environmental field for any period of time, environmental data does not always follow typical gradients. You can have preferential pathways on site that may cause sample concentrations to actually increase in the direction opposite from the discharge location. Incomplete delineation, may exclude data points from the calculation, resulting in an inaccurate final calculated value, which is obviously problematic. Just to note here, unlike other remedies such as excavation, where post-remediation sampling can be used to address contamination that is not delineated or data gaps, there is no follow-up sampling conducted when using compliance averaging. Thus, the need for complete delineation when using compliance averaging. Next slide.
Okay, we have our third test your knowledge. So the question is, sample by sample delineation is critical before implementing compliance averaging. Is this A, true, or B, false? And you can go to the next slide. The answer is true, and I'll give it back to you, Greg.
Okay, thank you. All right, on to delineation documentation. What is the department really looking for? So reports with areas of concern that are addressed via compliance averaging really need to contain AOC-specific figures that clearly demonstrate complete horizontal and vertical delineation. It's one of the first things we look for when we start our review. I just want to remind everybody that figures that demonstrate complete delineation should really already exist, as AOC-specific maps and figures are already required pursuant to the tech regs. And as you can see here, I have provided a screenshot, and as you can see, it says maps and figures, map scale and orientation, including, if we drop down to number 2, states that maps and figures should contain sample locations, sample depths, and contaminant concentrations plotted on the map. And as you can see here with my red call out, please note contaminant concentrations should be plotted on the map. If they're not provided, we're going to ask for them. And that just starts the timely back and forth correspondence that we all want to avoid. Next slide, please. So, since the figures that show complete delineation should already exist, it'd be really helpful if you guys can pull them into the report where compliance averaging is utilized. If the figures are actually present in another document, then that document at a minimum should be referenced in their location along with the section and page number actually provided. In instances where delineation is not complete on a sample by sample point basis and the investigator elects to actually implement compliance averaging, then a variance is needed pursuant to 4.2, and as part of that variance, you have to provide a technical justification and the information required as part of a variance at 1.7. All of that has to be included in the report where the compliance averaging is presented. Next slide. Okay, thank you.
So now we're going to move on to Branko Trifunovic and Alex Iannone, who are going to be talking about common issues with data deliverables for compliance averaging. Branko's going to start us off. Go ahead.
Everyone, I'm Branko. I'm one of the compliance averaging component reviewers in the Bureau of Environmental Evaluation and Risk Assessment, and I'm going to be talking about data deliverables for, next slide. For the 95% UCL, arithmetic mean, and 75% 10x methods. Next slide, please. So as a refresher on what each of these three methods are and when they're used, the arithmetic mean method is used when you have fewer than 10 samples appropriate to use in a compliance averaging calculation. And that's just simple addition and division, where you add up all the samples that you have and then divide by the number of samples. 95% UCL, or upper confidence limit of the mean method, is a little more complicated, where you have to use a program like EPA's ProUCL, and that it's used when there's more than 9 samples because you need a minimum of 10 samples in order to generate a statistically sound UCL. And the 75% 10x method is only used in post-remedial situations, and it's considered compliant if 75% of the samples are below the standard and none are 10 times higher than the standard. Next slide, please. So this is a table just briefly summarizing what sort of deliverables the department is looking for by the compliance averaging method used. So for all three methods, there should be a figure showing the samples used and a table showing the samples used. For 95% UCL, the input data, as in what is being input into the program, should be provided, and the output data as well, so what's being spit out by the program that generates the 95% UCL. It should be noted that for 75% 10x, the figure should also show the area that underwent remediation, because it's only supposed to use the samples that were in an area that underwent remediation. And somewhere in the narrative should also have the remediation volume, because the minimum number of samples for the 75% 10x method depends on the volume of soil that was remediated. Next slide, please. So just to go into a little bit more detail about what these deliverables entail. So the figure should detail which samples are included in the calculation. There should also be a table that's also detailing which samples are included. The input data for ProUCL or any other program that was used should be included in the report, and the output from ProUCL or any other program. For 75% 10x, there should be a figure showing the remediation area footprint, and somewhere in the narrative, there should detail the remediation area volume. Next slide, please. So in these slides, there's examples of the sort of figures that the department is looking for these deliverables for the compliance averaging methods. So here is one for a lead investigation, which is an ingestion dermal pathway contaminant, and in this case, the fictional LSRP for this site is looking for compliance with residential remediation standards. So this, you don't have to have a figure that's exactly like this. It just shows some of the requirements the department is looking for. So there are sample IDs, the depths and concentrations on tables on the figure. There's a key which clearly shows which samples are omitted from the calculations, because you're only supposed to use the contaminated samples plus the first ring of clean samples. You have a black cross which shows which lead samples are contaminated, and then a green circle which shows which lead samples are clean. Next slide, please. And here's an example of a data table for the compliance averaging calculation. So because in this case there was two separate quarter-acre functional areas, there's going to be one table for functional area 1 and one table for functional area 2. So here it very clearly lays out which samples are included in each calculation, their sample ID, their depth, and the concentration. One thing I want to note too is that there are two non-detect samples, and they have a value in parentheses, which is half the reporting limit. In a later part of the presentation, Adam Hackenberg will go into detail on the non-detects. Next slide, please. And here's an example of the kind of input which is put into EPA's ProUCL program to generate a 95% UCL. On the left is a column with a contaminant name, in this case lead, their concentrations, and on the right is a column that's formatted to let the ProUCL program know which contaminants are detects versus non-detects. A 1 is used for detect, whereas a 0 is used for a non-detect. Next slide, please. So here's an example of the sort of output that you get from the ProUCL program. In this case, it's been abridged a little bit because the output is several pages long. It can't all fit on one slide. And it gives general statistics, which show you the number of observations, the number of detects, non-detects, the minimum, maximum, things like that. And as you scroll down, the program generates multiple UCLs based on different data distributions. And if you scroll all the way down to the end, it gives what's circled here a suggested UCL to use, depending on what sort of distribution your data set is in. So in this case, it represents a UCL of 136.5 milligrams per kilogram. And because the new lead standard is 200 milligrams per kilogram, this data set is considered compliant. And one thing I do want to point out too, if you look at the top left part of the slide, is that this says UCL statistics for data sets with non-detects. So in this case, because there is a non-detect in the data set, this is the method that should be used. There's another method that's for UCL statistics for data sets with full data sets, which is only used if you have no non-detects. The distinction is important because the calculation is different depending on if you have detects or non-detects in your data set. Next slide, please. And then here's an example of a figure that we use for 75% 10x. Much like the one that was used for 95% UCL earlier, you have the samples, IDs, their depths, and their concentrations, and it shows which are contaminated and which are clean. But it also has a highlighted area that shows the excavation, which neatly shows that all the samples are taken from the excavation area. Next slide, please. All right, now I'm going to hand it over to Alex Iannone to deal with the spatially weighted averaging deliverables.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Alex Iannone, also from BIRA, and I'm going to be talking about spatially weighted averaging data deliverables. Example deliverables for spatially weighted average submittals were added to the attainment guidance in Appendix A. The purpose is to clarify what SWA deliverables should be included in the submittal, and the two major components are tables and figures. So what is spatially weighted averaging? Spatially weighted averaging involves the creation of polygons based on proximity of sampling point locations and a defined functional area boundary. The corresponding polygon assumes contaminant concentrations detected at the sampling location. The polygon concentration is weighted by its percentage of the total functional area to generate a weighted value. The weighted values for each polygon are added together to calculate an SWA for the given functional area. And I want to mention these figures are different from the ones we need to document delineation, as Greg discussed earlier. Next slide. Why are SWA deliverables important? SWA is serving as the remedial action for a given area, and the deliverables document compliance with the attainment guidance. The SWA deliverable should be readily available, as those inputs are necessary to run the SWA application. And this is an example of the lead ingestion dermal pathway figure required on the left there. So a separate figure for each pathway, contaminant, functional area, and vertical zone should be submitted and labeled as such. Sample location should be labeled and exceedances identified. Any remediated polygons, if applicable, should also be identified in some manner. Next slide, please. The corresponding table should clearly state the pathway, contaminant, functional area, and vertical zone. The table should include the following: sample ID, X and Y column, sample depth, contaminant concentration, polygon area, percent of total area, weighted value, and if applicable, a remediated column. Whether the spatially weighted average passes or fails should be clearly stated and compared with the applicable soil remediation standard. And as you can see, to find the spatially weighted average, you take column 5, the lead concentration, multiply it by column 7, the percent of total area, to get your weighted value, and then add it up all together, you generate your spatially weighted average. And that's it.
Okay, thank you so much to Branko Trifinovic and Alex Iannone. We are now moving on to our second Q&A session. It looks like we only have a few questions, so if you have a question now, please pose it in the chat. And if we're done a little bit early, we'll start the next presentation a little early. So I'll start with the first question. Can one use 7510X on PCB cleanups if the remedial goal is 1 parts per million and some of the verification samples exceed 1 part per million?
So that's a little bit of a difficult question from the perspective that while the 7510X document obviously allows contaminant delineation, there are TSCA issues that also come into play. So with PCBs, you have to address both the DEP regulations and TSCA regulations, and TSCA regulations prohibit the use of averaging.
Okay, next question. The tech rule required labs provide MDLs and PQLs until 2018 when the tech rule changed to our reporting limit MDL. There will be many pre-2008 non-detect results where reporting limits will not be available in the lab packages. How can these non-detect values be handled for use in averaging?
Yeah, I mean, at that point, I guess we'd have to work with you folks on developing some type of approach to generate a value that at least is representative of what an RL should be. I'm not exactly sure how to go about doing that. I'm not a lab person, but we do have people in-house that can perhaps look at those lab data sheets, and we'd have to come up with something that would be site-specific in terms of in terms of having a value to represent a reporting limit.
Okay. The question is, I don't believe it is appropriate to use half the detection limit when calculating the 95 UCL and Pro UCL. The detection limit should be entered unchanged.
We're going to discuss this issue a little bit later on, and we do provide an explanation as to how the Attainment Committee arrived at the value of 1/2 the reporting limit to use. That was not an easy decision. We looked at a host of different variables, And all I can say is that we did reach consensus on that, and that is the value that we are using moving forward with the release of this guidance document. So hopefully our discussion of that later on in this presentation will help answer that question.
Okay.
And one thing I do want to note with that too is that what the EPA Pro UCL guidance says on that is that they recommend not using a simple substitution method where you replace all non-detects with half the reporting limit, but it doesn't say at all whether what it should be replaced with should be the method detection limit or the reporting limit or half the reporting limit. So the EPA's Pro UCL guidance doesn't make any sort of recommendation on which of these numbers should be used for the reporting limit.
Okay, next question. In the SWA, can the vertical zone cover a larger thickness than only 6 inches? Is there a limit?
Well, the vertical zone that's established for your functional area, and it's not specific to just basically weighted averaging, should never really be 6 inches. I'm not sure if the question is related to a 6-inch sampling increment, which is what the tech rules require in terms of how to, the increment from which you obtain your sample. But the vertical zones, for instance, when you're trying to achieve compliance with a residential standard, are from 0 to 2 foot, and then 2 foot to whatever depth you achieve contaminant delineation.
Okay. How are polygons generated using the spatially weighted average method? Are there typical softwares utilized for this compliance attainment method?
The answer to that question is yes. The polygon boundaries are typically derived using a computer program such as, ArcGIS, and basically the boundaries of each polygon represent the midpoints between a sample and the surrounding samples.
Okay, next is, when using spatially weighted averaging, does the limit of the functional area within an AOC have to extend to a clean sample in each direction?
So the functional area boundaries are established irrespective of the size of the contamination, right? So you can have one AOC, if it spans an acre and you're trying to comply with a residential standard, then you might need 4 functional areas, because for the residential pathway, the default size is a 1/4 acre. In instances where an AOC is smaller than that, then you would just default to the 1/4 acre size functional area.
Okay, next is, if we respond to a release by digging out the impacted soil, can we use 7510X to verify successful completion of the response?
Yeah, 7510X can apply to any situation where post-X sampling is conducted to document and verify that the contamination was successful in meeting the soil remediation standards. Obviously, if you're applying 7510X, you probably have a couple samples that exceed the standard. So yes, you can use 7510X when conducting like a single phase excavation and post-X sampling activity.
Okay, we have another minute or two, so I'll try to squeeze in another few questions. For 7510X, is single point compliance needed? If not, what is the recommendation when approaching a property boundary?
Okay, I'm going to defer that question to later on in the presentation, because we actually have a discussion that will cover that particular instance.
Okay. For the spatially weighted average, what do you do when the site is smaller than the functional area? The example map in the guidance shows the Thiessen polygons being cut off at the property boundary.
That would be acceptable. You can clip the boundaries of your polygons to the boundary of the site if it's less than the default size of the functional area that you're utilizing, which is obviously standard dependent in terms of residential versus non-residential and migration to groundwater pathway.
Is delineation required when using narrative standard approach for migration to groundwater standard?
I'm going to have to get back to you on that one in terms of the groundwater standard. Yes. Okay. The answer is yes. I just had one of our migration to groundwater people pop in, and if there's a specific scenario that you wanted to run by us with regards to that question, feel free to contact me and we'll work our way through that with you.
Okay, I think we're out of time, so I think we're going to be moving on to the next section. Thank you so much for answering the questions. So the next presentation, we're back to Branko. I'm sorry if I butcher your name, Branko, who will be discussing, Branko Trifonovic, who will be discussing averaging associated with historic fill.
Thanks. All right, hey everyone, it's me again. I'm talking about the new section 12.5, which is averaging associated with historic fill. Next slide, please. So this update of the attainment guidance is adding an attainment option that can be used in addition to the options already provided in the existing historic fill material technical guidance. So the compliance attainment guidance largely assumes a point discharge, which doesn't apply to historic fill. Like for example, in my last presentation, I mentioned how compliance averaging should include only the contaminated samples plus the first ring of delineation samples. That doesn't necessarily apply to a heterogeneous substance like historic fill, which doesn't follow typical contaminant gradients. And also, the existing historic fill guidance recommends a minimum number of samples too small for averaging, that if only those minimum number of samples were taken, you could end up with a lot of functional areas on your historic fill site that have no samples at all. And in terms of delineation, characterization and delineation according to the historic fill guidance stipulations is required. So it may not necessarily be sample by sample analytical delineation, but it could be things like test pits and other methods that are mentioned in the historic fill guidance. And also to be clear, the functional area stipulations according to the attainment guidance are still required when doing averaging for historic fill. Next slide, please. So in light of this sort of gap between the old version of the the old version of the compliance attainment guidance and the current historic fill guidance, we developed a sampling protocol for if compliance averaging is wished to be used with historic fill sites. So the minimum number of samples will depend on the functional area size. So if you're looking for compliance with residential standards and it's for a contaminant that's based on the ingestion dermal pathway, which would apply to most typical historic fill contaminants, then you would need 3 samples per quarter acre functional area at a minimum. If you're looking for compliance with residential standards and it's for a contaminant that follows the inhalation pathway, then you're looking at 4 samples minimum per half acre functional area. And if you're looking for compliance with non-residential standards, then you're looking for 9 samples minimum per 2 acre functional area. Next slide, please. So to make that a little clearer, here are some of the figures from the new section 12.5, where the top left figure is for a residential ingestion dermal scenario, where you have a 1 acre site divided into 4 quarter acre size functional areas that have 3 samples in each one. And then in the top right, there's a residential inhalation scenario, where you have the same 1 acre site, but divided into 2 half acre size functional areas with 4 samples minimum in each one. And the bottom is for the non-residential scenario for a 4 acre site that's divided into 2 2 acre size functional areas, which have a minimum of 9 samples in each functional area. Next slide, please. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Branko. Next, we're going to move back on to Greg, who's going to address a question that was asked, property boundary contamination associated with 7510X. So go ahead, Greg.
Okay, thank you. Next slide. So as mentioned previously, we've gotten this question, quite a few times over the last couple of years. So we provided some additional material in the guidance document to help clarify that. And I just want to, go over that here with this slide. So we've came up with this little mock scenario, and as you can see in the figure here, we have an industrial site where we had a lead hotspot was identified as an AOC, and an excavation was conducted. And the excavation is depicted here by this blue oval, and then we have a series of post-X samples represented by the smaller red circles. And as you can see towards the bottom left-hand corner of this excavation, we had a post-X sample where lead was detected at 1,800 parts per million. So in terms of the 10X part of the application, the the current lead residential ingestion-based standard is 200 parts per million. So 10 times 200 equals 2,000 parts per million. So, you know, the lead hit here of 1,800 parts per million is in compliance with the tax part of this option. But as you can see, immediately adjacent to the industrial site, you know, to the left, if you will, we have an off-site residential property. So in this particular instance, you know, delineation of the lead at 1,800 parts per million has to take place because of the fact that this residential property is right next door. And, you know, pursuant to the tech regs at 4.2A, 1, 2, and 3, you know, you have to document that contamination is not migrating off-site at concentrations above 200 parts per million. So the only way to do that would be through additional delineation. So it's really up to, you know, the investigator to use some professional judgment to determine when additional sampling, you know, should take place. You know, some site-specific factors that you have to take into account, obviously, are concentration. You know, is the sample that's above the standard, you know, 2 times the standard, or is it 9 times the standard? You know, what's the distance between that sample and the property boundary? You know, what's the slope of the property in that area? You know, is there potential for erosion, et cetera? So again, you know, we wanted to bring this issue, you know, to light in the guidance document. We've provided some clarifying text, and, you know, we hope that addresses the concern. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Greg Newman. Next up is Ted Toscos, who will be discussing functional area development in conjunction with alternate remediation standards.
We'll talk about a change in the document that discusses the development of alternative remediation standards. But before we get to that, we will recap a couple of basic concepts, starting with the functional area. So the functional area is really an area of the site that is sized to correspond either to a typical residential or typical non-residential site, so that we have some uniform size across the procedure. And the purpose of doing that is so that we have a fixed area, you know, a known quantity that is related to an AOC where the samples we're taking and where the procedure will be applied, as opposed to just having to make it up every time and trying to come up with a different idea. And this is a pretty standard concept across both state guidance, but also through EPA guidance. So it's a pretty standard concept. Next. So how do we pick what samples are going to go into the functional area in the calculation? Fundamentally, we have to use data that is just the amount of data that is necessary to delineate the AOC that's encompassed by the functional area, and it says in parentheses areas, because sometimes an AOC may be larger than the default size, and functional area needs to be broken up. Data below regulatory concern, quote unquote, clean, but I don't want to say clean because we're talking about remediation standards. So data below regulatory concern, other than what is needed to delineate the AOC, should not be included. In other words, we should try to avoid diluting our data set. And if there's another AOC in there that is not of regulatory concern, then clearly that is not to be included in the functional area and in the calculation. Next. And just to round out the discussion, if we're talking about a residential functional area for ingestion dermal exposure pathway, we're looking at 1/4 acre. If we're looking at inhalation, it's 1/2 acre. And for non-residential functional area, the size is 2 acres. Next. So there's now a discussion about alternative remediation standards in the guidance. And so if we have developed an ARS based on the ARS guidance for ingestion dermal and inhalation and or inhalation, but we've developed that on the scenario other than the default scenario, as it were. So if we were, say, using a recreational land use, and then we submitted that, and the department approved it, and we then wanted to use compliance averaging in conjunction with these ARS, but for whatever reason, the functional area size is different than the default sizes that are in this guidance, what it said before, a quarter acre, half acre, or 2 acre, depending on what it is. So if we have an ARS that was developed for a non-standard scenario, and if we're going to use a functional area that is a non-standard size, then we need to talk to the department and get a technical consultation just to be sure that what we're doing is actually acceptable before we go into it, and then get caught up in the review when it's too late, so to speak. Next. So, just like everything else, there is fine print to go with this. So, let's say we go through the process and we have our technical consult, and the department agrees that yes, it's all good. When everything is said and done, we will need an institutional controls only deed notice and a soil remedial action permit. And of course, that will result in a limited restricted use RAL. The whole point is that we need to memorialize the whole process, which is a non-default process on a couple of different levels. So there needs to be a permanent record of that in case land use changes down the line, and now the critical assumptions behind all those calculations don't apply, so potentially the remedy could no longer be protected. So we've got to go through these 3 steps to make sure that there is a permanent record of it. And I think that ought to be the last slide.
Yes, thanks so much, Ted. You can go to the next slide, Tyrone.
My name's Adam Hackenberg. I'm a senior project manager at Langen. I was going to say that this is the very last topic for today's training, but I can't do that anymore. It was, however, the very last topic that we addressed in the stakeholder committee. And that topic is the age-old question of how to treat non-detect results when using them in calculations or to generate data set statistics. Next slide, please. So with respect to the compliance and attainment guidance, the operative question here is, what value should I use for non-detect results when using those results to perform compliance averaging calculations? This question has been an ongoing source of uncertainty and confusion, in part because the previous version of the guidance from July 2021 specified different and inconsistent approaches for each of the 3 averaging options. So for arithmetic mean, you were supposed to use 0. For the 95% UCL method, you were supposed to use the method detection limit. And for the spatially weighted averaging option, you were supposed to use the reporting limit. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just discuss a little bit about what went into our decision-making process here. This is a topic that has not only been deliberated within the CSRR program, it has also been a topic that has been debated in the scientific community and the regulated and regulatory community literally for decades. Commonly used values are between the MDL, the method detection limit, and the RL. The attainment committee members evaluated and discussed the merits of the various potential approaches at length. And we also solicited input from individuals outside the committee, including CSRR management. Ultimately, we arrived at a decision to use the RL as the basis for the value to be substituted for ND results because it is derived from instrument calibration rather than statistically like the MDL. But using the RL would result in a high bias because it represents the upper limit of reasonable surrogate values that could be used. So we elected to go with 1/2 of the RL to mitigate that potential high bias. So we'd arrived at this decision to use 1/2 of the RL, and then another question was raised, and that is, well, which RL do we use? Do we use the RL, the target RL that's published in the soil remediation standards at 726D, or do we use the RLs that are reported by the laboratory on a sample and analyte specific basis? And of course, those are typically lower because they need to be to meet the published values. Next slide, please. So to drill down on this a little bit more deeply, we ran a comparison of sample and analyte specific RLs reported by laboratories to the target RLs in the SRS. The sample and analyte specific RLs were queried for 3 compounds, PCE, TCE, and vinyl chloride, whose lowest SRS are pretty close to the level of the target RLs. That's why we chose those as test cases. The query was performed on actual New Jersey project data from 2023 for approximately 40 sites, comprising around 900 total samples and representing about 10 different laboratories. And as indicated in the summary table on this slide, we found that the median laboratory reported RLs for these compounds are approximately 1/4 of the target RLs in the SRS. So based on this analysis, we were able to agree as a group that it made sense to use the laboratory reported RLs instead of the SRS target RLs, so as to give credit to the labs that can achieve lower RLs and also to encourage LSRPs and PRCRs to use those laboratories. Next slide, please. All right, so the bottom line, if you missed it, we're using 1/2 of the RL as reported by the laboratory on a sample and analyte specific basis for all 3 compliance averaging methods, those including arithmetic mean, 95% UCL, and spatially weighted averaging. There's one important exception, though, which I want to point out here, and that is there may be some instances where half the reporting limit would actually end up being lower than the method detection limit. If that happens, you should be aware of it, and you should choose the method detection limit then instead of half of the RL. Next slide, please. I should also point out that all of this is discussed not only throughout the guidance document in the compliance averaging sections, but also there is a nice summary of it in Appendix C of the updated guidance. This last slide covers documentation requirements when substituting 1/2 of the RL or the MDL in limited circumstances. And what the department would like you to do when you're using those values is to make sure with your compliance averaging submission to include the relevant sample summary data sheets that show what those values are, either the RL or, again, in limited circumstances, the MDL. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to Adam Hackenberg. Yes, okay, great. So now we have Steve. Let's go back to his slides so we can restart his presentation on the single vertical zone when applying compliance averaging to the migration to groundwater pathway.
So anyway, I'm Steve Poston, associated with LSRPA and also WSP, although I'm about 98% retired at this point. But so let's move on to the first slide, number 168. And if it's not apparent from this slide, we're finally getting to the good stuff in this presentation. But anyway, there's a difference between how compliance averaging works with the migration to groundwater relative to direct contact soil remediation standards. And the the difference is based on this equation that's used to calculate the default migration to groundwater standard. And you'll see that there's a component of this called the DAF, or the dilution attenuation factor. Next slide, please. And the dilution attenuation factor includes a length component. And it's that length component that defines the difference in how the averaging procedure is performed. So currently DEP is using a default of 30 meters, or about 100 feet, which is, the length of a quarter-acre square residential parcel to define this length parameter. And so what that does in the analysis of compliance averaging, and you can move on to the next slide, is it requires that a site be divided up into these lengths, 100-foot lengths, perpendicular to groundwater flow. And these 100-foot length areas become like the functional areas within which the compliance averaging needs to be performed. We move on to the next slide. So it's kind of difficult to start to divide your site into those 100-foot strips and kind of then perform the analysis within each one. And the problem in the past has been the prior guidance document required that in addition to that division into 100-foot lengths, you had to do two analyses, one with samples 2 feet above the water table, and then a second analysis with the remaining samples. And that added complexity kind of resulted in pretty limited application of the method, because it was difficult to just find enough samples to actually perform the analysis. So the committee reviewed the basic assumptions behind that soil water partition equation, so the equation on the first slide, and realized that that equation just assumes that the unsaturated zone is a single zone. So in the derivation of the default migration to groundwater standards assumes that there's just a single zone in the unsaturated zone. And so next slide, please. We were able to then use that logic to simplify a bit the application of the compliance averaging for migration to groundwater. So the 100-foot strip, or the 100-foot length requirement, is still there because it's a basic component of the soil water partition equation. But now, as specified in the current guidance, there's really only one zone that needs to be analyzed to move forward with that method. And I guess I should add that, this applies obviously to the default SRS calculated with the saltwater partition equation, but the 100-foot strip concept also would apply to use of the synthetic precipitation leaching procedure, so the SPLP method to identify a alternative remediation standard, as well as a result that would come out of the sea soil model, because both of those methods require comparison to the leachate criterion, which is a separate value contained in the soil remediation standards. And that leachate criterion is basically the groundwater standard multiplied by 20, which is basically the result of application of that dilution attenuation factor. So really all of the methods to look at MGW still require that 100-foot length analysis at the site, but again, now only require a single vertical zone, vertical functional area. And I think that's it go to the next slide.
We have our final test your knowledge question, which was supposed to come a little bit earlier, but we had to be flexible. So the question is, how many vertical functional areas are needed to use compliance averaging for the soil remediation standard for the migration to groundwater exposure pathway? Is it A, 1, from the ground surface to the depth of the water table, or B, 2, including one surface FA and one subsurface FA functional area? And the answer is A, 1. So it's from the ground surface to the depth of the water table. So you can go to the next, or can you go to after Adam's presentation? Thank you so much. So I'm going to turn it over to Jess at this point to go through our final Q&A segment.
Okay, thank you so much. So the first question is, for the 1/2 reporting limit for non-detect samples, what if the reporting limit is higher than the standard, or if it is higher than the regulatory reporting limit?
Yeah, I mean, that would be a unique circumstance. I think the only instance where that would occur would be if there's another compound in that analytical suite that's causing, the elevated detection levels for other compounds. So again, I think that'd be something that you'd want to discuss with us. I don't know if there's an answer that would be our default answer. We'd probably want to take a look at that analytical data and try and determine what's going on and arrive at a value that we're all comfortable with using.
Okay, next question. This is for Adam. The reporting limit half rule is logical, but what about situations where the Kaplan-Meier is invoked by pro-UCL? Isn't that a violation of Kaplan and Meyer's assumption for use of their method?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I guess start by saying I'm not a statistician, but my understanding is that what you would do with half the RL is plug that into pro-UCL, and then it would still use the bootstrap method to calculate or to establish a value to use that is somewhere between half the RL and 0 to sort of substitute in there for the bootstrap method that they use within pro-UCL currently to generate the statistics. So it wouldn't actually use half the RL as a straight up value.
Okay, next question. If using historic data where reporting limits are not available, would it be acceptable to use the MDL for non-detects?
So again, we're talking about a lot of site-specific type of circumstances here. I don't know how far you'd have to go back where you wouldn't have data that does contain a reporting limit. So again, I think that's a conversation we'd have to have in terms of how old is the data? Is the data still meaningful in terms of it being representative? What type of fraction are we talking about here? So again, I think I don't think there's a common rule that I could trot out to always answer that question. It would be very site-specific based on the data that we're trying to figure out, how to assess that in terms of non-detects.
Okay, next question. This is for Adam. Is it necessary to isolate and extract the sample summary pages with the sample RLs out of the lab data package and into another section of the report?
I think that is the intent if you are submitting your compliance averaging calculations in a submission that is different than the RI report that initially contained the lab packages. However, if you're submitting both of those things together, a document with the lab packages that has the compliance averaging calculations, you could likely just refer to, the specific page numbers where the reviewer could look at the lab summary sheet in question.
Okay, next question. Could more clarification?
I'll just add to that. The intent is when the department gets these packages, some of the lab packages, depending on the number of samples and analytical fractions and the raw data, can be, thousands of pages. And, at the time where these calculations are being conducted and an LSRP or a project manager is actually wading through that to find the lab sheet, because you have to identify what half the RL is on a sample specific basis. At that point, you have the sheet in front of you. So we're just asking you to repackage that. It's typically going to be just a few samples per data set on, what I would say a typical data set. That's what we're looking for you to do. This way it's clear, it's something that we can easily verify. Because if we can't, and again, then we're just going to go back and ask you folks to help us locate it. So we're asking for that up front.
Okay, next question. Could more clarification be provided for the width of those 100-foot functional area segments?
Yeah, I could touch on that. So we're talking about the migration to groundwater pathway here, and the length, as Steve mentioned, which is parallel to groundwater flow, is divided by 100 foot. The width of that contamination extends to basically where you've established a clean zone through sampling. So it's wherever whatever samples on, moving perpendicular, if you will, to the left and right or east and west, whatever the direction may be, the width is defined by, your samples that provide adequate delineation.
Okay, next and final question for this section of the presentation. To confirm for the single vertical functional area, how is the groundwater table being defined? Does this include or exclude the capillary fringe?
So again, there are some groundwater documents that define, how to determine exactly where the water table is. So I would defer, to those documents, but it does typically include the capillary fringe.
Okay, now we will be moving on to questions regarding the field sampling procedures manual. So thanks to everyone who presented in that section. This is the first question. Can you explain what full scan mode means with respect to analyzing for 1,4-dioxane only in site media?
Hi, Eileen Snyder, here again from the laboratory. So the GCMS instrument can be operated in both the full scan and the selected ion monitoring or SIM mode, right? So it is important to dialogue with your laboratory about how they're performing the analysis and really get into the detail about what process are they using, what analytical approach are they using to get you the end result that you need, which is, data that's of sufficient sensitivity to meet your regulatory criteria. So the laboratory, again, has a lot of choices, knowing on the front end during your project planning whether you need to meet a specific remediation standard is key, because then they'll sort of reverse engineer their approach and figure out how to get there. So again, if you're running a GCMS in full scan mode, so that's kind of a wide angle lens almost, you're going to capture a lot of target analytes, but your sensitivity for each target analyte may not be where you need it to be for contaminants of emerging concern, such as 1,4-dioxane, to meet a certain remediation standard.
Okay, next question. NJDEP states in their PFAS sampling fact sheet that they are requesting PRPs report the full list of PFAS compounds associated with an analytical method. It sounds like this is not a requirement, but rather just the department's preference. Therefore, it would be up to the PRP to decide if they want to report the full list or not. Is this correct?
I can answer that one. So we do state this specifically in our fact sheet, and it was discussed with our legal team. So in accordance with NJSA 58-10A-10.3, the department is requesting that the full list of PFAS compounds analyzed and reported by the respective analytical methods be reported. The LSRP must ensure that the remediation is protective of public health and safety and the environment based upon all information in the possession of the LSRP and the PRCR. If the PRCR and or LSRP has information regarding the presence of PFAS, irrespective of whether the PFAS is currently listed as a hazardous substance, the PRCR is still responsible for remediation of such contaminant if the PRCR has reason to believe the presence of the contaminant poses a risk to the public health or safety of the environment. So basically, yes, you are required to submit the full scan to the DEP.
Okay, next question. If a lab's MDL can meet standards, but the RL is above the standards, is that acceptable data?
So this is Eileen Snyder again from the laboratory end of things. As we discussed in this training, laboratories oftentimes have challenges in meeting the lowest possible level of sensitivity for a sample analysis due to matrix effects. You know, the interferences that may be present in the sample, mitigating the laboratory's ability to get down to the lowest possible reporting limit. As was discussed in the attainment guidance talk, you know, the RL is a reporting limit that's based on an instrument calibration, whereas the MDL, the method reporting limit, MDL, is a statistically derived number, and it's important to take a look at them both. Laboratories will attempt to meet the RL and report data to a reporting limit calibrated again that meets or is below a remediation standard. That may not be possible in all cases. So sometimes the laboratory has to report data between the RL and the MDL, and sometimes it has to report data all the way down to the MDL. It's a challenge. Data generally are considered usable. It's important for the remediation professional to really take a look at the data and document the laboratory's best effort to get down to a sensitivity level needed, and then document the challenges the laboratory may have encountered in that process and thereby had to report that data closer to the MDL. So data should be considered usable with an explanation by the data user.
Okay, next question. What happens when a PFAS compound is reported without a standard?
It's kind of a good question. So calibration standards are oftentimes not available for every single target analyte that you want to report. And this includes PFAS. So laboratories purchase commercially available mixes of standards for methods including PFAS methods. So you may not have a one-to-one analog for every single target analyte for a calibration standard. That's okay. The method that you're selecting, whether it's the drinking water method or the 1633 for non-potable water and soil sediment, allows for that scenario. So it's okay. Laboratories can only purchase what's commercially available. That is the basis for which they are offered certification, right, by the department. The laboratory should be running performance test samples to demonstrate to the department that they can isolate, identify, and report at a level of sensitivity needed each of those target analytes using the calibration mix that's available commercially.
If only one PFAS compound, let's say PFOA, exceeds the calculated MGW ARS, but all other PFAS compounds are below the remediation standards, including the calculated MG ARS, would we have only PFOA reported in groundwater samples, or would we need to sample groundwater and have all PFAS compounds reported, even though only PFOA exceeded in soils? This assumes the site soils have been properly characterized?
Jumping in for this, I would say you would still want to look at all PFAS compounds in groundwater because MGW, it's a point in time that you were looking at that soil sample. You don't know what was there, 10, 20 years ago that may have already leached out of the soils and impacted the underlying groundwater. So it's possible that even if something isn't showing up in soil, it still could have impacted the groundwater.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Does New Jersey allow the use of method OIA 1677 for cyanide in groundwater?
Hi, this is Eileen Snyder again from the lab perspective. We just asked that question, right, of the department at our monthly laboratory advisory committee meeting, and the answer is yes. As you all know, the department proposed in January of this year, 2024, groundwater quality standards rule amendment changes. And that included a compound called free cyanide, and that offered a groundwater quality standard that was quite lower than what's currently in the groundwater quality standards. So those rule amendments are expected to go final by the end of this year or by January 1st or 2nd, and the department will accept a sufficiently sensitive method, such as the OIA 1677, to analyze for free cyanide in groundwater.
Great. Thank you, Eileen. Thank you for all our presenters today. You did an amazing job. Thank you for all our attendees. We are going to close the training at this point. If your question did not get answered, don't fret. You will receive an email with the response. As one last reminder, please fill out our survey to let us know what you thought of the training today so we know for the future what to do differently or what you'd like to see. So thank you all so much. Have a great day.